It is the spring of 1940, and somewhere in the cold Atlantic waters, a German U-boat commander stands in the conning tower of his vessel, binoculars pressed against his eyes. The night is dark, almost absolute, broken only by the faint outline of a merchant ship moving through the water perhaps 2 miles away. He has been hunting for weeks. His crew is tired, their provisions are running low, but this moment, this singular, crystalline moment, represents everything the German Naval Command has promised him. An enemy ship, vulnerable, within range. The commander gives the order. Down below, deep in the submarine's iron belly, a torpedo is loaded into its tube with mechanical precision. The hiss of compressed air fills the chamber. Everyone holds their breath. The weapon is released, and for a brief instant, there is the satisfied sense that the order has been executed perfectly, that German engineering and German will have aligned once more. Then nothing happens. The torpedo runs beneath the water, exactly as designed. It travels the correct distance. It should strike with devastating force, but the ship above continues on its way, completely unaware that it has just been spared by the very weapon meant to destroy it. The commander watches in stunned silence as the merchant vessel disappears into the darkness, untouched, and in that moment of profound frustration and confusion, he becomes part of one of the Second World War's most extraordinary and least understood stories, a crisis of engineering and intelligence that would ultimately reshape the balance of power in the Atlantic. This is the history of the German torpedo crisis of 1940. A period when Germany's most sophisticated underwater weapons failed repeatedly, catastrophically, and in ways that seemed almost impossible to explain. It is a story about the gap between expectation and reality, between what engineers believe their creations can do and what actually occurs when those creations meet the complexities of the natural world. It is, perhaps most importantly, a story about how a nation at the height of its technological confidence discovered that confidence alone cannot guarantee success. If you find yourself drawn to the lesser-known turning points of the Second World War, the moments where chance, engineering failure, and human uncertainty shaped the course of history as profoundly as strategy and force, then you might want to subscribe to Fall Asleep To, where we explore complete histories like this one, the kind of deep, unfolding narratives that reveal the hidden textures beneath the surface of what we thought we already understood. Now, to understand how such a crisis could even occur, we must first travel backward, to the years before the war itself. The German submarine service had been rebuilt in secret during the 1930s, after the First World War had left the German Navy fractured and diminished. The Treaty of Versailles had forbidden Germany from possessing submarines at all, but secretly, methodically, German engineers had begun designing what would become the U-boat fleet. These were not supposed to be merely weapons. They were supposed to be perfect instruments of naval warfare, vessels that would allow Germany to strangle Britain's merchant shipping and cut off the supplies upon which the island nation depended. Central to this dream of submarine supremacy was the torpedo itself, not the old impact torpedoes of the First World War, the ones that simply had to strike a target with physical force to detonate. No, the modern German torpedoes of the late 1930s incorporated something far more sophisticated: magnetic detonators. The theory was elegant and, on paper, nearly perfect. Rather than requiring the weapon to strike the hull of a ship directly, the magnetic detonator would sense the magnetic field generated by a large steel vessel and trigger the explosion even if the torpedo passed directly beneath it. This meant that a torpedo did not need to hit the exact center of a target. It could pass under the enemy ship, and the detonation would break the vessel's back, far more effectively than an impact blow alone could manage. The German Navy, and particularly the submarine service, had adopted this technology with enthusiasm. They called their most modern torpedoes the G7E and the G7A models. The G7E ran on battery power, leaving no telltale bubble trail on the surface that would alert a target to the torpedo's approach. The G7A burned compressed air and alcohol, traveling faster but leaving that bubble trail. Both featured magnetic detonators. Both were considered state-of-the-art. The engineers who designed them were among the finest Germany possessed, working in weapons factories where precision and innovation were the ordinary language of their daily work. And yet, something was profoundly wrong. Nobody knew it yet. The crisis had not yet begun, but the seeds had been planted long before any torpedo ever entered the Atlantic, long before any commander gave the order to fire, long before any merchant ship sailed unwittingly past a weapon that should have destroyed it. The seeds lay in the assumptions that Germany's brightest minds had made about how the world worked, assumptions that seemed so reasonable, so well-founded in theory and in the laboratory, that it never occurred to anyone to question them. The question that hangs over this entire narrative, the question that drew commanders to distraction and drove German naval strategists to despair, is this: how could a weapon so carefully designed, so thoroughly tested, so confidently deployed, fail so completely and so repeatedly? The answer lies somewhere in the intersection of theoretical physics, engineering tolerance, and the brutal unpredictability of combat conditions. The German Naval Command in the spring of 1940 was operating under what might be called a beautiful illusion. Their submarine fleet, the Kriegsmarine's pride, had been equipped with a weapon that on paper seemed almost miraculous, a marvel of engineering that promised to transform naval warfare itself. The G7E torpedo, as it was designated, represented years of research and refinement. It was faster than anything the Allies possessed, sleeker in its design, and it carried within its metal hull a propulsion system that seemed to belong almost to the future itself. Yet as the campaign season began and German U-boats took to the Atlantic, pushing deeper into waters where British convoys moved laden with supplies and soldiers bound for the island fortress, something was terribly, systematically wrong. Consider for a moment the nature of a torpedo. It is, in essence, a machine of profound simplicity, disguised as complexity, a self-propelled weapon that must travel through an alien medium at speed, aim itself toward a moving target, and detonate with enough force to tear open the hull of a warship. Every variable matters immensely: the angle of approach, the depth at which the weapon runs beneath the surface, the precise moment of detonation. The German engineers had invested tremendous effort in perfecting these elements, and yet their calculations, their blueprints, their painstaking assembly work were all built upon assumptions that the sea itself would not validate. In the early months of 1940, German U-boat commanders began reporting something that bordered on the inexplicable. Ships were being attacked. The periscope sights were clear, the calculations were sound, the firing solutions optimal. The torpedo was observed leaving the tube, its white wake trailing through the water as it raced toward its target. And then, nothing. The weapon passed beneath the vessel, or it struck with a dull thud, a mechanical sound that spoke of detonation without effect. Hulls that should have been rent open remained intact. Ships that should have sunk continued on their courses. The crews aboard, if they realized how narrowly death had passed them by, would have understood themselves to be witnesses to something more than luck. The reports filtered back through the submarine service with growing frequency. U-boat captains, men of considerable experience and tactical skill, found themselves questioning their own abilities, their own judgment. Had they miscalculated? Were their observations faulty? The psychological weight of firing upon an enemy vessel, of executing the maneuver that required both courage and precision, only to watch that enemy sail away unharmed, was immense. There is a particular frustration that comes from performing one's duty with accuracy and then discovering that the tools provided for that duty have betrayed you utterly. What made this situation even more layered, even more troubling, was that the German Naval High Command was largely unaware of the full scope of the problem. Information moved slowly through the military bureaucracy. Reports from individual commanders might be dismissed as anomalies or the result of operator error. A single failed detonation could be explained away. But when failure became systematic, when it began to describe a pattern so consistent that it could not be ignored, the question became not merely technical, but existential. Had Germany equipped its greatest submarine service with weapons that fundamentally did not work? The engineers and designers who had created the G7E torpedo found themselves in an unusual position. Their weapon had been tested, of course, before deployment. Trials had been conducted. The torpedo had performed as designed during those carefully controlled exercises in the Baltic, in the restricted waters where conditions could be managed, where variables could be minimized. In those environments, it had behaved like the sophisticated instrument it was meant to be. But the Atlantic Ocean is not a testing range. The waters through which convoys traveled were cold, their chemistry variable, their salinity dependent on currents and location. The pressure at different depths affected everything: the mechanical systems, the fuses, the very physics of explosion itself. What the engineers had not fully accounted for, what the limitations of pre-war testing had obscured, was that their torpedo's detonation mechanism was far more fragile than anyone had admitted to themselves. The mechanism was magnetic. The torpedo was designed to explode not through direct contact with a ship's hull, but rather through the detection of the massive magnetic field that surrounds any large vessel made of steel and moving through salt water. The moment the weapon passed beneath such a field, a fuse would be triggered. Theoretically, this offered a tremendous advantage. A near miss could still deliver catastrophic damage, blowing a ship's keel upward from below the waterline in a way that contact explosions could not always achieve. But there existed a problem, one that had roots in the very nature of the Earth's magnetic field itself, and how it behaved in different latitudes. The magnetic compass on which the fuse relied operated according to principles established centuries ago, principles that held true in the temperate and northern waters where German submarines had been developed and tested. However, as these weapons traveled further south, as operations extended into warmer latitudes, the angle at which Earth's magnetic field presented itself to the fuse changed. The fuse, rigidly designed for operation within a specific range of magnetic inclination, would simply fail to trigger. The ship's magnetic field would pass above the torpedo's sensor, felt but not acknowledged, and the weapon would continue on its trajectory, a mechanical projectile traveling through empty water with no purpose left to fulfill. It was a kind of tragic irony, the sort of moment in history where brilliant minds and skilled hands created something that seemed perfect, until reality applied a pressure that the design had never encountered. The engineers in Berlin, the captains in the Atlantic, the sailors in the submarines hunched in their metal tubes beneath hostile waters. None of them had fully appreciated the extent to which their weapon was a creature of specific circumstances, dependent upon conditions that the war itself refused to provide. The German Navy, in those early months of 1940, carried itself with the confidence of a force that had begun to taste victory. After the invasion of Poland the previous September, after Denmark and Norway fell in April, the Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable on land. But beneath the surface of the Atlantic, something far more troubling was quietly unfolding, and it would grow to consume the thoughts of German admirals in a way that land campaigns never could. You see, the U-boat force, the Unterseeboot fleet, had been designed and trained for one primary purpose: the slow strangulation of Britain through commerce raiding. Sink enough merchant ships the theory went, and the island nation would starve. Britain depended entirely on imported food, fuel, and materials. Cut that lifeline, and surrender would follow. It was logical, it was ruthless. And by the summer of 1940, with the Battle of Britain beginning to unfold in the skies above London, the submarine war seemed like the perfect complement to air superiority. While the Luftwaffe fought Spitfires, the U-boats would work quietly below. But there was a problem that few outside the submarine service truly understood, and it was a problem that lived in the very heart of German naval engineering. The weapon itself, the torpedo, was on paper a marvel of German industrial precision. Called the G7E, it was electrically powered, which meant it left no visible wake of bubbles or smoke like the older steam-driven torpedoes did. This was revolutionary. It made detection far more difficult. The specifications looked perfect in Berlin. Length of over 23 feet, weight of nearly 3 tons. Capable, according to the blueprints and the theoretical calculations, of reaching speeds of 40 knots or more, and penetrating the hulls of even the largest British warships and merchant vessels. Every component had been tested. Every valve, every circuit, every detonator had been inspected and approved. Yet when these torpedoes entered actual combat in the waters off the British Isles and along the convoys' routes, something inexplicable began to happen. Ships that should have been destroyed remained afloat. Torpedoes that had been carefully aimed and fired from U-boats at close range were passing beneath targets without detonating. Others were running erratically, as if guided by invisible and unpredictable forces. Some were striking their targets but failing to explode. The German submariners, the men who had trained for years to execute this strategy, found themselves watching their weapons fail at the critical moment, again and again, a pattern so consistent it could not possibly be coincidence. The first reports came in quietly. A U-boat commander would file a patrol report noting that he had achieved what he believed to be a certain hit, only to see his target steam away unharmed. At first, these reports were treated with mild skepticism at headquarters. Captains, it was assumed, sometimes misjudged distance and angle in the chaos and darkness of an attack. The sea was vast and unpredictable. Visibility was poor. Perhaps the weapons had performed exactly as designed, and the error lay not with German engineering, but with German marksmanship. But as spring turned to summer in 1940, the pattern intensified. U-boat after U-boat reported similar failures. Some crews witnessed their torpedoes actually striking British ships, the impact clearly visible, the sound audible even from a distance, and yet no explosion followed. Imagine the psychological weight of that moment. You have executed a perfect attack. You have overcome the enemy's detection systems. You have positioned yourself at great risk and considerable expense of time and fuel. You have released your weapon with precision, and you see it hit its target, and nothing happens. The ship continues on, unscathed, and you must dive and disappear before counterattack forces you deeper into the abyss. This was not merely a technical failure. This was a strategic catastrophe developing in real time, though few in the high command seemed fully to grasp its implications at first. The torpedo crisis of 1940 was, in essence, a collision between theory and reality. The German Navy had designed and built a weapon based on calculations, laboratory tests, and simulations. But those calculations had been made under assumptions that did not hold true when the weapon entered active service in the actual waters of the Atlantic and the North Sea. The sea, it turned out, was more complex than the drawing boards of Stuttgart and the testing tanks of Kiel. There were, in fact, multiple problems, a layering of difficulties that only became apparent as failures accumulated. The first and most immediate was a phenomenon related to water pressure and detonation mechanisms. The German torpedoes, particularly the G7E model, were equipped with a magnetic detonator. This detonator was designed to be triggered by the magnetic field of a large ship's hull as the torpedo passed beneath it. The theory was elegant. Why waste a warhead tearing through just the point of contact when you could detonate beneath the keel and break the ship's back with the shock wave in the water itself? But this theory, sensible as it sounded in conference rooms in Berlin, met with a fundamental problem in the waters of the North Atlantic. The magnetic properties of the Earth's magnetic field are not uniform across the entire planet. Magnetic declination, the angle between true north and magnetic north, varies considerably with latitude. The German Navy, working primarily from calculations based on Central European conditions and German coastal waters, had not adequately compensated for these variations in the waters off Britain and in the wider Atlantic. Furthermore, the detonators themselves were unreliable. They were sensitive instruments, vulnerable to shock and vibration. The act of launching a torpedo from a submarine involved considerable mechanical stress. Compressed air or other propellant systems drove the weapon from its tube at tremendous force. The firing sequence was violent. These detonators, designed to respond to magnetic fields, were sometimes damaged or desensitized by the very process of their own launch, rendering them inoperable or erratic by the time they reached their target. There was also the matter of running depth. Every torpedo, when fired, was set to run at a certain depth beneath the surface. This depth was calculated based on the expected size and draft of the target ship. But the G7E torpedoes of 1940 had a troubling tendency to run deeper than the depth settings indicated. A submarine commander might set his weapon to run at 10 feet below the surface, believing this would pass directly beneath the keel of a merchant vessel, only to discover, too often from the anguished reports of his fellow captains, that the weapon was actually passing 10 feet beneath that target depth, running harmlessly under the ship entirely. The causes of this depth-running anomaly were multiple and interactive. There was the matter of the torpedo's trim and buoyancy, affected by variables in its internal mechanisms and the physical degradation of seals and components over time. There was the phenomenon of temperature change in the water itself. The Atlantic in those seasons was cold, and cold water behaved differently than the calibration tanks in Germany, creating shifts in buoyancy and trim that the engineers had not fully predicted. The propulsion system itself, electric motors powered by batteries, created vibration and heat that affected the internal mechanisms that controlled depth. As the weeks of summer 1940 progressed, reports from the U-boat fleet grew increasingly desperate. Some commanders were pragmatic and began experimenting with solutions. They switched to contact detonators, simple percussion fuses that would detonate when the torpedo physically struck its target. This was a retreat from the theoretical elegance of the magnetic detonator, but it was also admission of failure. A contact detonator was, in many respects, a weapon designed for an earlier era. You could not always guarantee that a contact fuse would fire under the shock of impact, particularly if the impact angle was oblique. You lost the advantages of a deep detonation that could break the back of a large ship. Yet even these contact detonators were not entirely reliable. The mechanical systems of the time, while precise by the standards of 1940, were still subject to manufacturing variations and gradual degradation. Some detonators fired, others did not. The problem persisted, adapting and metamorphosing as German engineers attempted quick fixes that addressed one failure mode while sometimes creating others. The crisis deepened throughout the summer and into the autumn. Tonnage sunk per U-boat patrol began to decline. The calculations that had suggested Britain could be strangled into submission through submarine warfare began to seem less assured. If the rate of sinking continued to drop, it would eventually become uneconomical to send U-boats to sea at all. The fuel burned, the men risked, the boats expended in losses to British countermeasures. All of this had to be justified by sufficient tonnage destroyed. If the weapons were not working, the entire strategic framework of the submarine war began to collapse. The question that haunted the German Navy's leadership during these months was simple and profound. How was it possible that their engineers, their laboratories, their industrial capacity, all of which had been marshaled toward creating a superior weapon, had produced something that was failing so consistently in actual combat? And more importantly, how could this be fixed? Time was not their friend. Britain was still in the war. The opportunity to destroy British shipping and force surrender was real, but it was also narrowing, moment by moment. By the autumn of 1940, the German Navy's submarine command had begun to receive deeply troubling reports from the captains operating along the convoy routes of the Atlantic. The boats were encountering British and Norwegian merchant vessels with increasing regularity, yet something was profoundly wrong with the exchange. Captains who had trained for years, who understood the mathematics of ballistics and depth measurement, as intimately as a musician understands their instrument, were reporting a phenomenon that seemed almost impossible, that their torpedoes were not detonating upon impact. Picture, if you will, the perspective of a submarine commander in those months. He would maneuver his vessel through darkened waters, often with extraordinary patience, waiting for hours in the cold watch, while his crew maintained absolute silence. The tension in a U-boat during an attack was something almost tangible, men breathing shallowly, the only sounds the gentle hum of electrical systems and the occasional creak of the hull responding to pressure changes. When the moment came, when the captain was certain of his targeting solution, he would give the command. The torpedoes would slide from their tubes with a peculiar rush and whoosh, leaving trails of bubbles in the ocean behind them. And then, silence again. The captain would wait. His eyes would be fixed to the periscope or on the depth gauges, listening through hydrophone equipment, straining to hear the sound that should come, the unmistakable concussion of a detonation against the target's hull. But that sound, more often than not in 1940, never arrived. Instead, what sometimes occurred was something more mysterious still. A captain might observe through his periscope as a torpedo passed directly beneath a merchant vessel. Another might witness what appeared to be a glancing strike against the side of a ship, a visible impact, and yet no explosion followed. The target would continue on its course, unharmed, as if the torpedo had been nothing more than a shadow passing in the depths. Some captains reported even stranger occurrences, torpedoes that seemed to run erratically, their paths curving away from the intended target without reason, or those that dove too deeply, passing harmlessly beneath their prey. The cumulative effect of these failures was not merely a tactical frustration, it was something far more significant. It was the systematic undermining of Germany's entire naval strategy in the Atlantic. The German High Command, and particularly Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat fleet with an almost obsessive attention to detail, had constructed their entire war plan in the Atlantic around a fundamental assumption that their submarines, with their superior numbers and coordinated wolf-pack tactics, could strangle British supply lines and force the nation to surrender through sheer attrition. The mathematics of this strategy were clear and compelling. If enough tonnage could be sunk, if the loss rate of merchant shipping could exceed the British capacity to replace and repair vessels, then Britain would simply run out of food, fuel, and materials. It was not a strategy of conquest, but of exhaustion. Yet this strategy only worked if the torpedoes functioned as advertised. For weeks in the autumn of 1940, captains submitted their reports, and these reports began to accumulate in the offices of naval commanders. At first, there was skepticism. Submarine commanders were, by necessity, proud men. Men who had volunteered for a duty that was among the most dangerous in all of warfare. The idea that their own equipment might be failing them, rather than their own skill, was somehow difficult to accept. There was a tendency in the command structure to assume, at least initially, that the reports reflected errors in observation or miscalculation rather than fundamental mechanical failure. A captain might have misjudged the distance. He might have miscalculated the speed of the target vessel. The explosion might have occurred below the surface where it could not be heard. These were the explanations that officers wanted to believe. But as October turned toward November, and as more and more boats filed more and more reports, a pattern emerged that could no longer be dismissed or rationalized away. The failure rate was not marginal, it was catastrophic. German naval records from this period, preserved and studied in the decades after the war, indicate that somewhere between 30 and 40% of all torpedoes fired during this interval were failing to detonate. Some historians suggest the true figure was even higher. What this meant, in practical terms, was that the submarine captains were expending their most precious resource, these delicate, complex mechanical devices that were expensive to manufacture and difficult to replace, with an effectiveness rate barely better than a coin flip. The human cost of this failure was profound, though it was a cost measured in ways that were not immediately visible to those in command. Every failed torpedo represented not only a missed opportunity to strike at an enemy vessel, but also the exposure of a U-boat's position. A submarine, by its nature, could only remain hidden through silence and invisibility. But the moment a torpedo was launched, the captain had announced his presence to the entire convoy. The hunting destroyers and corvettes that accompanied the merchant ships would immediately begin their search, listening intently through their hydrophone equipment for any sound that might indicate the location of the undersea predator. So when a torpedo failed to detonate, when the expected explosion did not occur, the U-boat commander was left in an impossible situation. He could fire another torpedo, further exposing himself, or he could attempt to disengage from the encounter and fade back into the depths, abandoning the attack. Either choice extracted a price. The supply of torpedoes was finite, and every moment spent in fruitless attack was a moment when depth charges or ramming attacks by escort vessels became increasingly likely. And for the crews of the submarines, young men, many of them barely out of their teens, working in conditions of extraordinary stress and danger, each failed attack was another day of their lives consumed by a war that seemed to be slipping away from them, moment by moment, in the dark waters of the Atlantic. By November of 1940, the accumulation of these failures had reached a critical juncture. Admiral Dönitz demanded answers. How could the most advanced naval power in Europe find itself with weapons that functioned with such apparent unreliability? The investigation that followed would reveal a truth that was, in its own way, as complex and troubling as the mystery itself. And so by the late summer of 1940, the German Navy found itself in a peculiar and growing predicament. The men in Berlin, those officers studying charts and performance reports in their headquarters, began to notice something troubling in the dispatches coming from the Atlantic. The U-boats were returning from patrol with empty torpedo racks. The crews reported successful attacks. The calculations suggested hits had been made, yet ships that ought to have gone down simply kept sailing. Picture, if you will, the minds of these commanders as they pored over the evidence. A U-boat surfaces in calm waters and sends a torpedo racing toward a British merchant vessel. The submarine captain watches through the periscope, his eye pressed against the glass, his heart steady with the confidence of a hunter. The torpedo tracks toward its target. The geometry is perfect. And then, nothing. No explosion, no bloom of fire across the water, just the sound of the torpedo passing beneath the ship, disappearing harmlessly into the depths below. It must have felt almost like a kind of betrayal. though they would not have used such a word. These were precision instruments, manufactured by skilled German engineers in factories that had come to represent the pinnacle of technical achievement. And yet something was fundamentally wrong. The reports began to accumulate. In July, a U-boat commanded by Günther Prien, and he was a man of some renown by this point, one of the celebrated submarine captains whose exploits had been celebrated in German propaganda, encountered what he believed to be a clear opportunity. He positioned himself, made his calculations, fired his weapons. The torpedoes ran true. The captain watched and waited for the detonation. It did not come. The British ship sailed on, untouched by any visible damage. And this was not an isolated occurrence. Similar stories emerged from other patrol lines. A U-boat would report an encounter with a large warship. The tactical situation would have been described as favorable. Multiple torpedoes would have been expended, and then silence from the target. No sinking, no distress calls, just the perplexing, maddening silence that suggested nothing had happened at all. Consider the psychological weight of this for a moment. A submarine commander does not have the luxury of lingering to observe the full consequences of his attack. Once a torpedo is fired, he must take evasive action. Depth charges from the target vessel's escort ships would come moments later. He would dive deep into the darkness, the hull groaning around him, his crew silent with tension. And in those quiet hours beneath the surface, alone with his thoughts and the knowledge that he had fired upon the enemy, he would wonder, had he missed? Had the torpedo malfunctioned? Was the intelligence about the target incorrect? The uncertainty would gnaw at him, unanswered, until he returned to port. By August of 1940, it became apparent that this was not merely a matter of individual failures or bad luck. The pattern was too consistent. The frequency was too high. Something systematic was broken in the German torpedo arsenal. In fact, the British had noticed it too, though they did not fully understand why their own vulnerability seemed to have decreased. Some British naval officers, reading the reports of U-boat attacks that failed to produce casualties, began to wonder if perhaps German torpedoes were simply unreliable weapons. The German Naval High Command, or the Oberkommando der Kriegsmarine as it was formerly known, found itself in the uncomfortable position of acknowledging that their most important underwater weapon had a critical flaw. But what was the flaw? That was the question that would consume the attention of engineers, officers, and weapons experts for months to come. Was it a mechanical issue, a design problem, a manufacturing defect that had gone undetected in testing? There was, at this point, a certain irony to the situation. Germany had poured considerable resources into developing and manufacturing submarines and torpedoes. The U-boat arm of the Navy was meant to be the instrument of German naval dominance in the Atlantic. Yet here they were, vessels laden with weapons that apparently did not work as designed. The gap between expectation and reality was widening with each passing week, and nobody quite knew how to bridge it. The frustration was not merely technical, it was strategic. The whole purpose of the U-boat campaign was to sink British merchant shipping, to strangle the island nation's ability to import food and raw materials, to bring it to its knees through attrition. If the U-boats could not effectively sink ships, then what was the point of the campaign? What were all these vessels doing, disappearing into the fog and storms of the Atlantic, burning fuel, enduring the cold and the constant fear, only to return with reports of attacks that produced no results? There was also a dimension of professional pride involved. The U-boat captains, many of them highly trained and experienced men, took great pride in their ability to locate and engage enemy vessels. To have that expertise undermined by equipment failure was not merely frustrating from a technical standpoint, it was personally wounding. A captain who could not sink ships, through no fault of his own, was a captain who could not succeed in his mission. And so the investigation began, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency. Experts were assigned to examine the problem. Testing facilities were prepared. The question that hung over everything was deceptively simple. Why are our torpedoes not sinking their targets? The answer, when it finally began to emerge, would prove to be far more complex than anyone had anticipated, involving engineering challenges that German weapons designers had not adequately considered, and mistakes in the development process that had somehow escaped notice until lives and resources were being squandered at sea. As the autumn weeks pressed forward into November of 1940, something peculiar began to unfold beneath the grey Atlantic waters. The German Navy had received their first reports from the U-boat commanders who'd been tracking the British convoys, and the stories they brought back were troubling. Ships that should have been sinking were continuing forward. Merchant vessels struck by what seemed to be direct hits were somehow limping along, smoke rising from their hulls but their engines still turning, their crews still fighting. It was as though the ocean itself had begun to conspire against German success. Consider for a moment what it must have felt like to be a U-boat captain in those months. You'd trained for years, learned to read the currents and the stars, mastered the art of stealth and patience. You'd crept through the darkness with your crew, found your target, angled your boat to deliver what you believed to be a killing blow. And then, nothing, or worse than nothing, the sound of the impact, the tremor through your vessel's hull that told you the detonation had occurred. And yet when you raised your periscope minutes later, your target remained afloat. The uncertainty of it all was perhaps more demoralizing than any depth charge or ramming attack. Kapitänleutnant Otto Kretschmer was one of the first to articulate his suspicions in writing. Kretschmer would eventually become one of Germany's most celebrated submarine commanders, a man whose tactical brilliance and calm under pressure earned him respect even from his enemies. But in these early months of 1940, even his experience and instinct couldn't explain what his boats were encountering. He reported that his torpedoes were either passing beneath the targets entirely without detonating, or striking the hulls with what he described as a dull, ineffective blow. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidence. The pattern suggested something was fundamentally wrong with the weapons themselves. The German Navy's technical office, based in Berlin, received these reports with a mixture of concern and bureaucratic skepticism. This was, after all, a military establishment built on hierarchy and certainty. Admitting that the weapons upon which the entire submarine strategy depended might be defective was to admit a fundamental failure in procurement, in design, in the very foundations of naval planning. And yet the reports kept coming. Kapitänleutnant Günther Prien, another legendary U-boat ace who'd famously penetrated the British naval base at Scapa Flow in 1940, reported similar difficulties. Commander after commander described the same frustrating phenomenon. Torpedoes that should have worked weren't working. There was, in these reports, a kind of exhausted patience. The U-boat captains weren't making excuses. They were trying to understand. They were professional sailors and warriors, and they understood that weapons sometimes failed. But the frequency of these failures, the pattern of them, suggested something more systematic, something that might be correctable, if only it could be properly understood and properly reported through the appropriate channels. The irony, which would only become apparent much later, was that the designers and engineers responsible for the German torpedo program were themselves aware of certain limitations in their design. They knew, in theory, that the magnetic detonator, that sophisticated mechanism which was supposed to trigger the warhead as it passed beneath a ship's hull, had never been fully tested under combat conditions. They knew that the acoustic homing mechanism, that remarkable innovation which was meant to track a ship's propeller noise, had only been tested in controlled environments. They knew, in the abstract, that there were gaps between theory and practice, but knowing and acting upon that knowledge were two entirely different propositions in the Wehrmacht of 1940. What's worth reflecting upon here is the nature of institutional knowledge and institutional blindness. When a military apparatus becomes sufficiently large, sufficiently bureaucratic, the truth of the world sometimes travels very slowly from the men doing the actual fighting to the men in the offices making decisions about production and deployment. The information had to travel up through chains of command, had to be corroborated, had to be documented, had to compete with 100 other reports and requests for attention, and at the same time, the officers overseeing the torpedo program had their reputations tied to those weapons. To admit failure was to invite consequences. By late autumn of 1940, the officers in Berlin had begun to hear the disquieting reports clearly enough that they couldn't ignore them entirely. But their response, initially, was not to launch a comprehensive investigation. Their response was far more measured, far more cautious. They began asking the U-boat captains to be more precise in their descriptions of failures. Where exactly, on the target's hull, did the torpedo strike? What angle of approach had been used? What were the weather conditions? What were the sea depths? It was the response of men who suspected there might be an explanation other than faulty weapons. Perhaps, they suggested, the captains needed better training. Perhaps they weren't approaching their targets correctly. Can you imagine the frustration that must have generated on the submarines? Here were men risking their lives, watching their weapons apparently fail again and again, sending back detailed reports of what they'd witnessed firsthand, and receiving in return what amounted to professional doubt. It created a kind of tension between the front lines and the command structure, a tension that would only grow as the weeks passed and more evidence accumulated. The fog of war, as they say, doesn't just obscure the enemy's intentions. Sometimes it obscures the truth about your own capabilities from those who most need to understand it. The autumn of 1940 pressed on. The Battle of the Atlantic continued, the convoys still moving, the submarines still hunting, and the weapons still failing with frustrating regularity. And yet the full scope of the problem, the entire depth of what was wrong with the German torpedo program, hadn't yet become apparent to anyone. The pieces of the puzzle were scattered across multiple U-boats, multiple reports, multiple officers working in isolation from one another. What was needed was someone with the authority to pull all those pieces together and see the complete picture. What was needed was someone willing to look at the evidence without flinching and ask, what if everything we think we know about these weapons is incomplete? The irony that would haunt German naval command for months was this: they possessed weapons of genuine destructive power, yet those weapons refused to work when it mattered most. By the spring of 1940, as German U-boats began their coordinated assault on British convoys in what the Germans called the happy time, they carried with them a technological marvel that should have given them overwhelming advantage. The German G7E torpedo, an electric-powered weapon, ran silent beneath the waves, with no telltale bubble trail to give away a submarine's position. It was, by the standards of the era, a sophisticated piece of engineering. And yet something was profoundly wrong. The first officers to notice the peculiarity were the submarine commanders themselves, men who had trained for years to understand the behavior of their weapons, men whose lives and the lives of their crews depended on split-second calculations of distance, depth, and trajectory. They would line up a merchant vessel in their periscope sights, calculate the proper angle of approach, establish what they believed to be an ideal firing solution, and release their torpedoes. They would listen through the hydrophones, waiting for that distant metallic crack that indicated a successful hit, that satisfying sound that meant a ship was going down. But increasingly, what they heard instead was silence, or worse, the sound of a torpedo running past its target without detonating. Commanders began to suspect a pattern. It seemed to happen most often when they attempted to strike from certain angles, particularly when firing from ahead of a target ship's course, when the torpedo would need to pass beneath the vessel to detonate against its hull. British ships, meanwhile, reported something eerie: distant explosions underwater, far from where the actual attack was occurring, as if the German weapons were detonating prematurely or at entirely random depths. Some British sailors would later speak of ghostly booms in the water, underwater fireworks that seemed to serve no purpose except to warn them of danger. What was happening, it would turn out, was a collision between mechanical precision and the unpredictable physics of ocean warfare. The torpedoes were detonating, yes, but not at the depths they were designed to detonate at. The German magnetic detonator, the piece of engineering that was meant to fire the warhead when it sensed the magnetic field of a ship's steel hull passing overhead, was proving catastrophically unreliable in the cold northern waters of the Atlantic. The magnetic field of the Earth itself shifted in different latitudes, and at the colder temperatures of the North Atlantic, the sensitivity of the detonator mechanism was far too high. The torpedo would sense what it interpreted as a ship's magnetic signature when there was nothing there at all, or it would pass directly beneath a target and fail to trigger at all. There was also another, more mechanical failure at work. Some of the detonators contained a small copper ball that was supposed to slide into a firing pin mechanism only after the torpedo had traveled a certain distance, a safety feature designed to prevent accidental detonation near the submarine that fired it. But this copper ball, in certain conditions, and particularly in the colder waters, would sometimes jam or stick, rendering the detonator completely inert. A captain would fire his torpedo with perfect confidence and see nothing happen because the weapon had fundamentally failed to arm itself. Consider for a moment the psychological weight of this situation. A submarine commander is in a position of extraordinary vulnerability. He has brought his boat to the surface or to periscope depth, exposed himself to detection, and committed to an attack. The crew is tense, compressed into a metal tube beneath the sea, aware that discovery means likely death. The captain fires his weapon, the most advanced torpedo in the German arsenal, and then nothing. The target continues on its course, unharmed. The captain must then choose whether to surface and attempt another attack, deepening his exposure, or withdraw and try again later. When this happens not once or twice but dozens of times, the frustration begins to eat at the very foundation of confidence. By the summer of 1940, the German Naval Command was receiving increasingly distressed reports from their submarine force. Commanders were beginning to suspect that something was profoundly wrong with their weapons, not with their tactics or their skills. Some captains, frustrated and desperate to report some measure of success to their superiors, may have exaggerated their claims of sinkings, but even accounting for such optimism, the mathematics did not add up. The number of confirmed British vessel losses was far below what the tonnage of torpedoes fired should have produced. Something was systematically wrong. Yet, at the Kriegsmarine's headquarters in Berlin, the response to these growing concerns was characterized by something between denial and incomprehension. The engineers and designers who had created the G7E had done so with great confidence in its capabilities. It had been tested, had proven itself in controlled environments, had been certified as combat-ready. The idea that the weapon itself was fundamentally flawed was difficult for many in the command structure to accept. There was a tendency to attribute failures to captain error, to insufficient training, or to exaggerated British claims of having successfully evaded attacks. This denial would prove to be extraordinarily costly. For months, while German submarines continued to lose targets they should have destroyed, while frustration mounted in the undersea fleet, the command structure moved slowly toward acknowledging that the problem was not with the men or their tactics, but with the weapons themselves. What might have been solved relatively quickly through an investigation and redesign of the detonator mechanism instead festered, poisoning the confidence of the submarine force and in some ways marking the beginning of the end of the German undersea advantage that had seemed so promising in the early months of the war. The failures mounted, and with them came a growing recognition within the German Navy that something fundamental had gone terribly wrong. The men aboard the U-boats had been trained to believe in their weapons, to trust the engineering that had been promised to them by the High Command, and yet, night after night, that trust was being shattered in the cold waters of the Atlantic. And as we move deeper into the story of how this crisis unfolded, we begin to see how institutional pride, bureaucratic rivalries, and the fog of wartime decision-making all conspired to keep the truth hidden from those who needed to know it most. By the autumn of 1940, reports had begun to accumulate in the offices of German naval intelligence and among the submarine commanders themselves. The numbers didn't add up. Ships that should have sunk were sending distress signals. Convoys that intelligence suggested were lightly escorted were arriving at their destinations. The mathematics of successful warfare, the tonnage sunk versus the resources expended, simply refused to cooperate with the grand predictions that had been made. And yet, when these reports were compiled and sent upward through the naval hierarchy, something curious happened. They were not believed. Or perhaps more accurately, they were believed but not acted upon. The German Navy, in 1940, operated within a complex system of command and pride. The U-boat arm, in particular, had cultivated an almost mythical reputation. These submarines and their commanders represented innovation, daring, and a kind of warrior's nobility that appealed to the Nazi regime's imagination of what German military prowess should look like. Admiral Karl Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat fleet, was himself a brilliant tactician and a figure of considerable prestige. He had fought in submarines during the First World War, and had survived when many of his comrades did not. He carried with him the weight of that history, the sense of being one of an elite fraternity. When reports began to come in suggesting that the weapons these men were using were fundamentally flawed, the implications were profound. It wasn't simply that some technical adjustment was needed. It was an admission that the entire foundation upon which the U-boat campaign rested might be compromised. Consider for a moment the psychological burden this placed on those in command. Dönitz had staked his reputation on the U-boat's ability to strangle British commerce and force Britain to the negotiating table. He had presented detailed calculations to Adolf Hitler about tonnage sunk per month, about the timeline for victory, about the logical inevitability of German success if the U-boat campaign was given sufficient resources and support. And now, the evidence suggested these calculations had been made on the basis of faulty assumptions. The weapons didn't work as advertised. But what commander wishes to admit such a thing? What military institution readily accepts that its fundamental premises were flawed? There was another layer to this resistance, one born from the peculiar dynamics of Nazi Germany itself. The regime set great store by technological prowess, by the idea that German engineering and German ingenuity could overcome any obstacle. Reports suggesting systemic failure in weapon design contradicted this mythology. To acknowledge the problem fully and publicly would be to undermine confidence not just in the U-boat fleet, but potentially in the Nazi war machine as a whole, and in a system where the leadership had already committed the nation to a strategy dependent on early victory. Admissions of failure were dangerous. They created questions. Questions led to doubt. Doubt led to political vulnerability. So the reports accumulated in files. The U-boat commanders continued to send back accounts of failed attacks, of explosions that seemed muted or incomplete, of torpedoes that passed beneath their targets without detonating. These men were not prone to exaggeration or complaint. They were warriors, trained in the tradition of the German Navy, accustomed to accepting orders and executing them without question. When they reported problems, the problems were real. And yet, for months, the official response was muted. Investigations were begun, but slowly. Bureaucracies were set in motion, but they moved at the pace of institutional inertia. The men in the submarines were being sent back into the water with weapons they increasingly suspected would not serve them, and they were being told implicitly, through the slowness of official response, that perhaps they were simply not skillful enough, not aggressive enough, not sufficiently dedicated to their mission. This is where the psychological and technical strands of the story begin to interweave in a particularly poignant way. A U-boat commander, deep in the Atlantic, faced with the acoustic evidence that his torpedo had failed to detonate, had to make a choice. He could report it accurately and risk being perceived as making excuses, or he could rationalize it, blame it on pilot error, on the weather, on the target's unexpected course change. Many chose the latter path. How could they not? The alternative was to be complicit in what would eventually become an explicit admission that the entire weapon system was compromised. And so, unreliable reports flowed back to headquarters, mingling with the accurate ones, creating a fog through which the true extent of the problem became increasingly difficult to see. The men who ran the torpedo production facilities, meanwhile, operated in their own separate world. They had not sunk beneath the Atlantic in a fragile steel vessel listening to their weapons fail. They had not experienced the fear and frustration of a commander trying to explain to his crew why their attack had failed when all the calculations suggested it should have succeeded. What they had was the engineering specifications, the test results from controlled environments, the pride that comes from producing complex mechanical systems that, on paper, were marvels of German precision. When reports came back from the field, these engineers could rationalize discrepancies. Perhaps the submarines weren't using the torpedoes correctly. Perhaps the conditions at sea were different from what the designers had anticipated. Perhaps, and this was a common refrain, the problem lay not with the weapon, but with how it was being employed. Think about how this works in any organization, in any system. The gap between theory and practice, between what is designed and what is experienced, is often bridged not by honest conversation, but by mutual incomprehension. The engineer cannot fully appreciate the submarine commander's reality. The commander cannot fully grasp the engineer's perspective. And into this gap, institutional pride flows like water through a crack in a ship's hull. It widens the fissure. It deepens the separation. It makes repair harder with each passing day. By the autumn of 1940, the German Naval Command found itself caught between two deeply uncomfortable truths. The first was that their submarine fleet, despite its fearsome reputation, was not delivering the knockout blow to British commerce that the strategy demanded. The second was far more troubling. The men responsible for torpedo design and manufacture had begun to suspect, then to know with certainty, that their weapons were fundamentally broken. And no one knew quite what to do about it. The responsibility for this situation fell heavily upon the shoulders of a relatively small group of engineers and naval officers, each of whom had staked their professional reputations, and in some cases their careers and even their lives, on the performance of the German torpedo. At the center of this network stood men like Oskar Kusch, a U-boat commander whose eventual fate would become intertwined with the crisis in ways both tragic and emblematic. There were also the engineers at the torpedo factories in Friedrichshafen and elsewhere, men who had worked for years under the assumption that their designs were sound, that the tests they had conducted were adequate, and that the weapons would perform as intended when they finally met British targets in the dark waters of the North Atlantic. The technical specifications of the German G7E torpedo were impressive on paper. It was faster than many of its contemporaries, capable of reaching speeds of up to 30 knots, depending on the model and the conditions of deployment. It carried a warhead of approximately 300 kilograms of explosive material, a payload substantial enough to cripple or sink any merchant vessel it struck, and certainly lethal against the smaller escort vessels that had begun to appear in increasing numbers around the convoys. The design itself represented years of incremental refinement, stretching back to the earlier models used in the First World War and modified through the interwar period as designers attempted to balance speed, range, accuracy, and reliability. Yet speed and payload were meaningless if the detonator would not function. And by this point in the war, the torpedo crews and commanders had begun to accumulate evidence that the magnetic detonator system, which was supposed to trigger the explosion even if the torpedo passed beneath a ship's hull, was failing in a significant proportion of cases. Some historians have suggested that the actual failure rate may have been as high as 30 or even 40% during certain periods, though the exact figures remain somewhat obscured by the passage of time and the fragmentary nature of wartime records. The consequences of these failures were that U-boat commanders would find themselves in situations of almost unbearable frustration. They might spend hours maneuvering their vessel into an optimal firing position, burning precious fuel, taking enormous risks by surfacing or remaining at shallow depth where the boat was most vulnerable to detection. They might fire their full complement of torpedoes at a clearly visible target, observe what appeared to be direct hits, hear the underwater concussions that suggested detonation, and then watch in stunned disbelief as the merchant ship continued on its course, undamaged, leaving only the telltale paths of the failed weapons on the surface of the water. Think for a moment about the psychological toll that must have taken. A U-boat captain had trained for years for moments like these. He had internalized the technical specifications of his weapons. He had rehearsed the firing procedures countless times. He had accepted the profound risks inherent in submarine warfare, knowing that any mistake, any moment of hesitation or inattention might result in death for himself and his crew. And then, when the moment came, when all the preparation and courage and luck had somehow aligned to place him in a position where he could strike a meaningful blow, his weapon failed him. Some commanders began to document these failures meticulously, filling their war diaries with detailed accounts of torpedo strikes that seemed to produce no effect. Measurements of distances and angles, notes on the conditions of the sea and the weather, anything that might help identify what was going wrong. These documents would eventually make their way up the chain of command, and they painted a picture of a crisis that was becoming increasingly difficult to deny or rationalize away. By late 1940 and into the following year, the evidence had accumulated sufficiently that the German naval hierarchy could no longer simply ignore the problem or attribute it to the imagination of overtired commanders. Yet the response of the military bureaucracy was slow, compartmentalized, and far from straightforward. There were inquiries launched, reviews ordered, committees formed. In some cases, the engineers who had designed the torpedoes began their own investigations, driven not by institutional pressure, but by professional pride and the desire to understand what had gone wrong with their creations. One of the central mysteries that emerged from this investigation concerned the magnetic detonator itself. The technology had been relatively new when it was incorporated into the G7E design, and it represented a significant technological advance over the simple contact fuses that had been used in the First World War. The magnetic detonator was designed to respond to the metal hull of a ship, triggering the explosion when the torpedo passed beneath it. This would ideally produce a catastrophic structural failure in the target vessel, breaking the ship's back, as it were, rather than simply creating a hole in the hull. The theory was sound. The engineering seemed correct, Yet something in the interaction between the weapon and the environment in which it operated was causing the system to fail. Some torpedoes detonated prematurely, perhaps triggered by the Earth's magnetic field or by some anomaly in the water itself. Others failed to detonate at all when they struck their targets. The variations seemed to depend on factors that were not fully understood, including the latitude at which the torpedo was employed, the magnetic properties of the local seawater, the depth at which the U-boat had launched the weapon, and the angle of approach toward the target. As autumn turned to winter in 1940, and the winter gave way to spring of 1941, the crisis deepened rather than resolved. U-boat commanders grew increasingly demoralized by the failures. The contrast between the confidence they had felt at the beginning of the campaign and the despair that now began to creep into their reports was stark and poignant. The submarine force had been assured that it possessed weapons capable of winning the war, or at least of bringing the British to the negotiating table through the strangulation of their maritime supply lines. Instead, what they had was a system riddled with unpredictable failures and no clear path to fixing the problem quickly. The Naval Command, meanwhile, faced a profound dilemma. To acknowledge the full extent of the crisis would be to admit that the strategy upon which so much had been staked was fundamentally undermined. It would require massive resource allocation to redesign and retool production. It would expose failures in the testing and development process that had allowed such a flawed weapon to be deployed on such a large scale. And in the context of Nazi Germany in 1941, admitting such failures could have consequences that extended far beyond mere professional embarrassment. The men who worked in the torpedo maintenance bays of Wilhelmshaven and other German naval ports had begun to notice something troubling in the early months of 1940, though few of them dared speak it aloud within earshot of their commanding officers. They were seeing a pattern that seemed impossible, almost as though fate itself had turned against German engineering, a tradition that had been, until this moment, nearly unassailable in its reputation for precision and devastating reliability. The torpedoes that left the dockyards passed all their theoretical tests. They ran true in the practice ranges. They sang through the water with the efficiency their designers had promised. Yet when they met actual enemy vessels, when they faced the hulls of British destroyers and merchant ships carrying supplies to keep an island nation alive, something in the mechanism failed. Consider the peculiar psychology of such a discovery. These were engineers and sailors who had been taught their entire lives that German manufacturing was supreme, that the nation's technical prowess was unmatched, that the weapons they serviced represented the cutting edge of modern warfare. And now, piece by piece, report by report, a different reality was assembling itself. The reports came from U-boat commanders returning to port with tales of bafflement. They described situations that should have resulted in certain victory, targets squared in the crosshairs, optimal range, conditions favorable for an attack, yet the torpedoes either missed entirely or struck the target with insufficient detonation to sink it. Some commanders began to suspect their crews of incompetence. Others wondered if they themselves were making tactical errors, but a few, the more observant among them, began to wonder if the fault lay in the weapon itself. The German Navy's technical bureau, known formally as the Technische Abteilung, existed in a state of peculiar tension during this period. The organization was tasked with solving exactly these kinds of problems, yet it operated within a command structure that was itself conflicted about how to interpret failure. Admiral Erich Raeder, who commanded the entire Kriegsmarine, was a man caught between optimism and the gathering evidence of reality. He believed in the superiority of German weapons, yet reports were accumulating that could not be dismissed entirely. There existed a natural institutional pressure to find explanations that did not implicate the fundamental design of the torpedoes themselves. Perhaps the problem lay elsewhere. Perhaps it was pilot error. Perhaps British ships possessed some new form of armor that the German intelligence services had not yet accounted for. What made this particular crisis so psychologically complex was the layering of secrecy within secrecy. The German High Command did not want the existence of widespread torpedo failures to become known to the crew of U-boats, who might lose confidence in their primary weapon system. Yet those crews were the ones experiencing the failures firsthand, and their morale was beginning to suffer in ways that could not be entirely concealed. There was a growing sense among submariners that they were being sent to sea with unreliable weapons, that their commanders were either lying to them or themselves did not understand the true nature of the problem. This created a corrosive effect on naval effectiveness that went far beyond the simple technical question of whether a torpedo detonated properly. The winter months of 1940 turned into spring, and the strategic situation in the Atlantic began to shift in ways that made the torpedo crisis even more urgent. Germany had invaded Norway in April, and the campaign there had consumed significant naval resources. The German surface fleet had suffered losses that diminished its overall striking power. What remained was an increasingly submarine-centric strategy for interdicting British supply lines. The U-boat arm, in other words, had become even more critical to German strategic hopes. And it was precisely this arm that was hobbled by a weapon that seemed to work in theory but failed in practice. One of the fascinating aspects of this crisis, when viewed from a distance of decades, is how long it took for the fundamental problem to be properly diagnosed and corrected. This was not, it is important to understand, a matter of simple oversight or negligence on the part of German engineers. Rather, it reflected a deeper organizational and cultural challenge. The German Navy operated under assumptions that made certain kinds of self-criticism difficult. To admit that a major weapon system had been inadequately tested before being deployed en masse was to admit that the entire pre-war development program had contained a serious flaw. Such admissions were not made easily in a military organization operating under the assumption of national superiority and technical infallibility. The men in the technical bureaus who were tasked with investigating the failures faced their own peculiar pressures. They needed to maintain their standing within the command structure, while simultaneously pursuing the truth. They had to balance the demand for quick solutions with the need for rigorous testing and diagnosis. They had to present their findings in ways that would be accepted by superiors who were themselves psychologically invested in believing that German weapons simply functioned properly, that if there were problems, they must be attributable to factors beyond the design itself. By mid-1940, several distinct theories had emerged regarding the cause of the failures. Some officers believed the problem lay in the magnetic detonator, the device that was supposed to trigger the warhead when the torpedo detected the magnetic field generated by a steel-hulled ship. This detonator represented a significant advance in torpedo technology, theoretically allowing a weapon to detonate beneath a ship's keel, where the explosion would be most devastating. Yet there were whispers, carefully passed between officers, that the detonator might be unstable in certain conditions, that it might be subject to premature detonation, or might fail to trigger at all in other circumstances. Others proposed that the problem lay in the depth-keeping mechanisms, the systems designed to maintain the torpedo at a preset depth as it traveled toward its target. Still others wondered whether the problem was environmental, whether the cold waters of the North Atlantic created conditions that the weapons had not been designed to encounter. What emerges from historical accounts of this period is a picture of genuine confusion and professional frustration. The German Navy was attempting to wage a sophisticated campaign of commerce destruction against a technologically advanced opponent, yet it was discovering that some of its most sophisticated weapons possessed serious and perhaps fundamental flaws. The U-boat commanders, meanwhile, were doing everything they could with the tools they had been given, pushing themselves to the edge of human endurance, traveling to distant waters, taking extraordinary risks, only to find that sometimes, fatally, their weapons would not do what they were supposed to do. There is something deeply human in that struggle, something that transcends the historical conflict itself and touches on the universal experience of working with tools that betray expectation. The torpedo crisis was, in many ways, a crisis of trust, not just in the weapons themselves, but in the entire system that had created those weapons and assured everyone they were reliable and ready. The weight of this failure began to settle differently on different shoulders as winter moved across the Atlantic. The submariners themselves, the men who had been promised these weapons, who had risked their lives in the freezing depths, they carried a peculiar kind of knowing. They understood something the Berlin Admiralty had not yet fully grasped, that a weapon is only as powerful as its reliability. Trust, once fractured, cannot easily be restored, and among the crews of the U-boat fleet, trust had become a scarce commodity indeed. Consider what it meant to be a captain in those months. You receive orders to attack. You position your boat with extraordinary care, maneuvering through darkness and sonar uncertainty, your entire crew holding their breath in the knowledge that discovery means death. The moment arrives, that singular, irreplaceable moment when you have a target in your sights and the sea itself seems to pause. You give the order. The torpedoes slip from their tubes with a tremor that runs through the entire vessel, and then nothing, or worse than nothing, sometimes a distant explosion, sometimes a ship continuing on its way as if you had fired blanks into the night. How many times could this happen before something inside the human spirit began to break? Not all at once, but gradually, like metal fatigued by repeated strain. The technical investigations into what had gone wrong were becoming more sophisticated by this point, more desperate in their urgency. German engineers were now examining recovered torpedoes, those few that had been returned from the sea floor or retrieved from failed attacks, and what they found was both straightforward and maddening. The magnetic detonators were indeed the primary culprit, but the problem was not quite what Kretschmer and the other captains had initially suspected. It wasn't simply that the detonators were too sensitive, though they were. It was rather that they were sensitive to the wrong thing, or perhaps more precisely, sensitive in ways that the designers had not fully understood. The Earth's magnetic field varies depending on where you are. This is something we now take for granted, something understood in any basic physics classroom. But in 1940, the full implications of this variation had not been adequately incorporated into the torpedo design. Scandinavian waters, where much of the early fighting had taken place, had peculiar magnetic characteristics. The magnetic field in the North Atlantic, the very region where Germany's submarine fleet was now operating with increasing frequency, was different again. A detonator calibrated for one region might behave entirely unpredictably in another. A weapon that had functioned adequately in tests conducted in German waters or in the Mediterranean might become unreliable or fail completely in the cold northern latitudes where the fiercest convoy battles were being fought. There was also the matter of water depth and pressure. As a torpedo traveled, as it descended toward its target, the pressure of the ocean changed around it. The detonator mechanisms, delicate instruments of springs and electrical contacts, were not fully protected against these variations. Some torpedoes that should have detonated beneath a ship's keel simply didn't. Others detonated prematurely, far too far away to cause damage. And some, in a particularly cruel twist of circumstance, detonated behind the ship, exploding in its wake, as if mocking the effort that had brought them there. What made this all the more frustrating was that the answers existed in theory. The engineers understood, at some level, what needed to be fixed. But understanding a problem and fixing it under wartime conditions are two entirely different things. There were debates about whether to switch to contact detonators, simpler mechanisms that would explode on physical impact rather than relying on magnetic sensing. But contact detonators had their own vulnerabilities. They were prone to premature detonation if they struck even light debris. They could be unreliable in the chaos of actually hitting a moving target, and they would require redesigning much of the torpedo's internal structure. Meanwhile, the pressure from above was relentless. Berlin wanted results. The Naval High Command was expecting the submarine campaign to yield increasing tonnage of Allied shipping. Instead, what they were getting were reports of failures, missed opportunities, and growing frustration from the men at sea. The gap between expectation and reality was widening, and that gap was becoming visible in the dispatches that crossed desks in Berlin with increasing frequency. By late 1940, a handful of operational measures had been implemented as temporary solutions. Some captains were now instructed to use only contact detonators, accepting the risks that came with them. Others were told to aim for the most favorable angles of attack, attempting to compensate for the magnetic detonator's failures through sheer tactical perfection. But these were band-aids on a wound that was beginning to reveal how deep the problem truly went. What strikes us now, looking back across the decades, is how this crisis in the torpedo technology became a kind of mirror for the broader uncertainties of the war itself. A military power that had achieved stunning initial successes through speed, innovation, and overwhelming force was beginning to discover that innovation under pressure is not always reliable. A weapon could seem perfect in theory and on the testing ground, yet fail catastrophically in the actual conditions of war. And once that failure became known, once the men using the weapon understood its limitations, the psychological damage became almost as significant as the technical problem. The engineers worked through the darkness of the German winter, consulting calculations and reviewing data, trying to understand not just what had failed, but why it had failed, and whether the solution they were proposing would work any better under the actual, messy conditions of Atlantic warfare. The engineers who had sacrificed so much in perfecting the magnetic detonator now faced a peculiar burden. They were not defeated by enemy action, but by the laws of physics itself, or rather, by their own incomplete understanding of them. The detonator had been designed in laboratories far removed from the cold waters of the Atlantic and the North Sea, where magnetism behaves in ways that shore-bound calculations had not fully accounted for. One might wonder whether any weapon system, no matter how brilliantly conceived, can ever be truly tested without encountering the world as it actually exists, rather than as theory predicts it should be. By the autumn of 1940, reports were arriving at German naval headquarters with increasing frequency and disturbing consistency. Commanders who had struck what they believed to be solid hits reported only silence. The expected explosions did not come. In many cases, the U-boat captains themselves could not understand what had gone wrong. They had positioned themselves correctly, had achieved the targeting solutions their training demanded, had heard what sounded distinctly like contact with the hull of an enemy vessel. And then, nothing. The silence that followed was perhaps more unnerving than any detonation would have been. This peculiar pattern of failures began to create a kind of cognitive dissonance among the submarine force. Some captains began to question their own perception, wondering whether they had truly made contact at all, or whether the sounds they heard were merely the acoustic tricks of the deep ocean playing upon tired minds. Others grew frustrated, almost angry, at what they perceived as a systematic malfunction in equipment they had been assured was revolutionary. A few wondered, darkly, whether there were saboteurs at work in the weapon factories, a suspicion that would later prove to have some basis in fact, though not in the way they imagined. The naval command structure, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the true scope of the problem. Communications between operational U-boats and the High Command were slow and often incomplete. By the time a report reached Berlin, several other patrols might have occurred, and the pattern that seemed so obvious to the submariners themselves was diluted by the sheer volume of operational data. Moreover, there was an institutional reluctance to acknowledge failure in so prominently touted a weapon. The magnetic detonator had been presented as evidence of German technological superiority, as proof that innovation and German engineering prowess would overcome any numerical disadvantage. To admit widespread failure would be to admit, in some sense, that the foundation of these claims was less solid than had been claimed. Yet the evidence continued to accumulate. By November of 1940, certain patterns had become impossible to ignore. Kapitän zur See Otto Kretschmer, one of Germany's most successful U-boat commanders, a man whose record and judgment were beyond question, reported not one or two, but multiple failures. He was not a man given to excuses or complaints. His combat record spoke for itself. If Kretschmer reported that his torpedoes were malfunctioning, then something was genuinely wrong. Other captains of similar caliber reported similar experiences, and now the pattern could no longer be dismissed as isolated incidents or operator error. The technical investigation that followed represented one of the more thorough examinations of weapons failure undertaken during the war. Engineers were dispatched to interview captains, to review firing records, to conduct tests in controlled environments. What they discovered was almost surprising in its complexity. The magnetic detonator, they confirmed, was working exactly as designed. The problem was not with the detonator itself, but with the assumptions that had been built into its design. The Earth's magnetic field, it turned out, varied considerably from region to region, something that had been known in theory but had not been adequately accounted for in the practical calibration of the weapon. Moreover, there was another factor that had not been fully predicted during the design phase. The British vessels that the U-boats were targeting possessed their own magnetic signatures, and these signatures varied depending on the ship's construction, its cargo, its heading relative to magnetic north, and numerous other variables. The detonator had been tuned for an average magnetic signature that, in practice, rarely matched the actual signature of any given target. It was as if the designers had calculated the average depth of the ocean and then built submarines that could only operate in water of exactly that depth. The psychological impact of these revelations spread through the U-boat command structure like a slow fog. Men who had been trained to believe in their equipment, who had made decisions and taken risks based on the assumption that their torpedoes would function reliably, now had to recalibrate their entire understanding of their own capabilities. A submarine captain's decisions are made in split seconds, based on accumulated knowledge and ingrained faith in the tools at his command. When that faith is shaken, when the captain must now calculate not only whether his targeting solution is correct, but also whether his torpedo will actually function, something fundamental changes in the psychology of combat. Some captains began to lose confidence in their own successes. If so many shots had failed, might not some of their claimed kills have been similarly ineffective? Officers began to suspect that the actual tonnage sunk by the U-boat fleet was lower than officially reported, a suspicion that, it must be noted, had some validity. Naval headquarters, meanwhile, found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having to acknowledge that recent claims of enemy shipping destroyed might need to be revised downward. This was not merely a matter of statistical accuracy. Tonnage claims translated directly into assessments of the U-boat campaign's effectiveness, which in turn influenced strategic planning and resource allocation at the highest levels of government. By early winter of 1940, the decision had been made to suspend use of the magnetic detonator on a widespread basis, at least until the problems could be more thoroughly understood and rectified. This decision represented a kind of admission of failure, though it was dressed in the language of technical adjustment and refinement. For the remainder of the year and into early 1941, Many U-boats operated with contact detonators, the older, more reliable mechanical systems that had been used before the magnetic innovation. The switch represented, in many ways, a return to the familiar, a retreat from the frontier of technological warfare back to the proven methods of the past. Yet even this represented a kind of failure of understanding, because neither the command structure nor the engineering corps had fully grasped the true nature of the problem with the magnetic detonator. The issue was not fundamentally that the design was flawed in concept, but rather that it had been deployed without adequate testing in the actual environments where it would be used. The designers had worked from theory, from laboratory measurements, from calculated assumptions about what the ocean and its magnetic properties would be. They had not reckoned sufficiently with the endless variability of the real world. In retrospect, one might reflect that this represents a universal challenge in weapons development, the gap between the controlled environment of the laboratory and the chaotic unpredictability of actual combat. How does one truly test a weapon designed to operate underwater, in the darkness, against moving targets, without deploying it into actual war? And if one waits until deployment to discover such failures, how many opportunities are lost before the problems are corrected? By late August and early September of 1940, the German High Command was beginning to confront something far more troubling than the mere absence of victory. They were facing the uncomfortable reality of systematic failure, and failure, as history would show, had a particular way of settling into the decision-making chambers of Berlin with the weight of accumulated dread. The torpedo crisis was no longer a technical puzzle to be solved by competent engineers working through the night. It had become a political problem, which meant that blame, responsibility, and the dangerous game of protecting one's position had begun to overshadow the pursuit of actual solutions. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had staked his reputation and his vision of submarine dominance on these weapons, found himself in an increasingly precarious position. He had been championing the U-boat campaign with unwavering confidence, assuring his superiors that the submarines could choke British supply lines and starve the island into submission. But month after month, the reports from the commanders in the field told a different story. Ships that should have sunk from a perfect hit continued steaming forward. Crews reported the sound of detonations that produced no damage. Torpedoes that appeared to run directly beneath their targets without the slightest trace of explosion. It was maddening, and for Dönitz, it was becoming a source of genuine anguish. The nature of this problem was peculiar, you see, because it existed almost entirely in a realm that no one could easily observe or measure in real time. A U-boat commander could fire his weapon in darkness, hear what sounded like success, and then never know with certainty whether he had actually damaged his prey. He would surface later, study the available intelligence, piece together reports from other vessels or shore-based observers, and gradually, often reluctantly, arrive at the conclusion that he had simply missed, or worse, that he had hit his target perfectly and the weapon had simply failed. That ambiguity created a toxic environment in which every commander questioned every engagement, every explosion, every piece of data. Throughout the summer and into the autumn, there were scattered efforts to investigate the failures more rigorously. Some commanding officers took it upon themselves to conduct informal experiments, firing their weapons at stationary targets or at vessels they could observe closely, hoping to gather concrete evidence about what was going wrong. These ad hoc investigations produced alarming findings. In one notable case, a U-boat fired what should have been a devastating salvo at a target that was anchored and entirely defenseless, and the torpedoes passed beneath it without detonating. Another vessel fired at a slow-moving merchant ship from a position that any veteran submariner would have considered a textbook perfect attack geometry, only to receive nothing but failure and frustration in return. The tragic irony underlying all of this was that Germany had invested enormous resources, considerable intellectual capital, and the hopes of an entire strategic doctrine in these weapons. The G7E and G7A torpedoes represented the cutting edge of what German engineering could produce. They had been designed with sophistication, tested in pools and controlled environments, and deployed to sea with the full confidence of the naval establishment. Yet somewhere between the drawing board and the actual moment of combat, something essential had been lost or miscalculated. And that something could not be easily recovered or rectified while the battle itself was ongoing. There was also, it should be noted, a profound element of human psychology at work in how this crisis unfolded. When people are invested in something they have created or championed, there exists a powerful tendency to blame external factors rather than the creation itself. Perhaps the commanders were not skilled enough. Perhaps the targeting calculations were slightly off. Perhaps the reports being sent back were exaggerated or misinterpreted. Perhaps the targets themselves were somehow different from what they appeared to be. These rationalizations circulated through the command structure, and they had the unfortunate effect of delaying serious inquiry into the actual mechanical and design flaws that were responsible for the catastrophe. By September, certain voices within the German Naval Command were beginning to call for a more systematic and official investigation. But here we encounter another layer of complexity that would have seemed almost absurd had it not been so consequential. The torpedo development program had been compartmentalized and distributed among different departments and different manufacturing facilities. Some of the most critical elements had been developed by the Torpedo Experimental Institute in Eckernförde. Others had been refined at torpedo workshops in various locations across Germany. The testing and validation of new designs had been handled by yet another set of institutions, and the actual manufacturing, assembly, and deployment of the weapons for operational service had been managed by still other authorities. This distribution of responsibility, which made sense from a wartime industrial perspective in many ways, created a serious problem when it came time to investigate systemic failures. No single person or office had complete oversight of the entire production and deployment chain. A defect identified at one location might not be communicated clearly to another. A solution proposed by one set of engineers might contradict the assumptions being made by a different team elsewhere. The organizational structure that had been designed to maximize production and efficiency had inadvertently created an environment in which information flowed poorly and coordinated action became extraordinarily difficult. What perhaps made this situation even more poignant was that some of the men involved in these various departments and facilities were genuinely excellent engineers who, under different circumstances, would have solved the problem with remarkable speed and ingenuity. German engineering in this period was world-class by any measure. The technical talent available to the Nazi regime was formidable, but talent, no matter how considerable, cannot always overcome the friction created by bureaucratic complexity, wartime urgency, organizational silos, and the simple fact that when you are in the midst of conducting a major military campaign, it is extraordinarily difficult to stop and thoroughly investigate the weapons you are using. There was also, it might be observed, a matter of timing that worked against any rapid resolution. The German Navy had deployed its submarines with the expectation that these weapons would work as designed. Operational plans had been drawn up based on that assumption. The strategic vision of knocking Britain out of the war through U-boat warfare was predicated on the lethality and reliability of German torpedoes. To acknowledge, even internally, that these weapons were fundamentally flawed would require not merely a technical fix, but a strategic reassessment. And that kind of reassessment, in the hierarchical and ideologically driven structures of Nazi Germany, was a politically delicate matter that could reflect poorly on various commands and institutions. As autumn advanced and the fog thickened over the Atlantic, U-boat commanders continued to conduct their operations with increasingly bitter awareness that something was profoundly wrong. They were brave men, disciplined and professional, executing their orders and doing their best to accomplish their missions under impossible circumstances. But with each failed attack, with each torpedo that simply would not perform as promised, there accumulated a reservoir of frustration and, in some cases, despair. What kind of fate was it to be a naval officer with a weapon that did not work, in a war that seemed to demand nothing less than absolute reliability from every instrument at your disposal? By the autumn of 1940, the scale of the torpedo failures had become impossible to ignore, even for those German naval officers who had, until now, accepted explanations and reassurances with a kind of professional resignation. The submarines were returning to their bases with accounts of strikes that should have produced explosions but produced only silence, or worse still, the metallic clang of warheads striking British hulls and departing as duds. Yet still, the orders continued. Still, the U-boats descended into the grey depths of the Atlantic, their crews compartmentalized in steel tubes, trusting in weapons that were, with increasing statistical certainty, failing them. What had begun as scattered reports from individual captains had now accumulated into something undeniable. Some of the most experienced commanders of the German submarine fleet, men like Günther Prien and Otto Kretschmer, had each, in their own words, documented encounters with the G7E that defied explanation. They had seen what they knew to be direct hits simply cease. No detonation. No moment of vindication for weeks of stalking and careful positioning. Nothing but the sound of a warhead striking steel at high velocity, and then the knowing, dreadful silence that followed. The German Naval Command, or Kriegsmarine, found itself in a position of profound institutional tension. To acknowledge that the entire submarine fleet was equipped with fundamentally defective weapons was to admit a failure of immense proportions, not merely a technical problem, but a systemic failure of testing, of engineering oversight, of quality assurance at the very highest levels of German arms production. Such an admission could undermine confidence not only in the weapon itself, but in the entire apparatus of German technological supremacy that had been, until now, a cornerstone of Nazi propaganda and military morale. And yet, beneath the surface of official denial, something far more troubling was beginning to happen. Quiet conversations were taking place in offices and wardrooms. Engineers who understood the mechanics of the weapon were being asked, in carefully guarded terms, whether there might be possibilities they had overlooked, whether certain design assumptions might, under certain specific conditions, prove invalid. The word malfunction began, very cautiously, to appear in internal memoranda. Not publicly, never publicly, but internally. Those who worked most closely with the torpedo were beginning to question what they had been assured was beyond question. By mid-autumn, a kind of shadow investigation had begun within the German naval hierarchy. Not an official inquiry. Such a thing would have been politically dangerous, would have required admissions and documentation that could be traced and questioned. Rather, it was something more diffuse and careful. Officers and technicians began to systematically review the reports. They began, with great circumspection, to examine the design specifications of the G7E in light of what the captains were telling them. And it was in this careful, unofficial examination that someone, the historical record does not clearly establish who, though suspicion has always rested on several likely candidates in the technical divisions, began to wonder about a possibility that, once voiced, seemed almost impossible to have been overlooked: the magnetic detonator. That elegant, theoretically superior mechanism that was meant to revolutionize submarine warfare. What if, under certain very specific conditions, what if the relationship between the warhead's magnetic field and the Earth's magnetic field varied not only with latitude, but with the depth of detonation itself. What if, in the temperate waters of the North Atlantic, at certain depths, the calculations that had been so confidently established in Baltic trials simply didn't apply? It is worth pausing here to acknowledge how such a thought might have emerged. The G7E had been tested extensively, of this there was no doubt, but those tests had been conducted under particular conditions, in relatively shallow northern European waters, at relatively shallow diving depths, against structures or dummies that were stationary or moving at predictable speeds. What had not been adequately tested? What perhaps could not have been adequately tested without an enormous expense of time and resources was the weapon's performance across the full range of conditions it would actually encounter in the Atlantic. Depth variation, temperature gradients, different magnetic properties of different ocean basins. The interaction of a German warhead's magnetic field with an all-steel British hull in conditions that were, in significant ways, quite different from the Baltic. The more carefully the shadow investigators looked at the data, the more this hypothesis began to hold an unsettling sort of coherence. It didn't explain every malfunction necessarily. Some failures might still be attributed to mechanical defects, to warheads that were simply defective units, to contact detonators that had failed. But a significant proportion of them, perhaps the great majority, might, just might, be explicable if the magnetic mechanism itself was subject to a variable that the designers had either overlooked or fatally underestimated. Here was a problem, though, that created its own kind of anguish within the naval command. To confirm such a hypothesis would require either extensive sea trials with the weapon, trials that would consume resources, time, and valuable U-boat sorties, or a radical alteration to the weapon's design itself. To alter the design would be to admit that the original design was flawed, and to admit the original design was flawed was to invite questions about how such a critical error could have occurred in German engineering, which was supposed to be without peer. Moreover, there was another layer of complication. The designers of the weapon, the engineers who had staked their professional reputations on the G7E and its magnetic detonator, were not men who welcomed suggestions that their work might require fundamental revision. They had, after all, assured everyone that the weapon was sound. They had provided calculations, specifications, confidence born of university training and technical rigor. The idea that they might have made an error of this magnitude, such a thing carried within it not merely the question of engineering competence, but questions of professional pride, of hierarchy, of who had the right to challenge whose expertise. And beneath all of this lay a question that no one spoke aloud, but which everyone understood. If the U-boats had been operating now for weeks and weeks, with weapons that were catastrophically unreliable, and if no one had detected this until recently, what did that say about the German Navy's command structure itself? What did it say about the effectiveness of their oversight? What did it say about the quality of intelligence flowing up from the boats to the high command? By the time the investigation had progressed this far, and we should understand that progress here means a slow accumulation of careful suspicions rather than dramatic revelation, the autumn of 1940 was deepening into the winter months. The Atlantic was growing colder and more treacherous. The U-boats continued their patrols, and somewhere, in the institutional depths of the Kriegsmarine, the terrible knowledge that something fundamental was wrong had begun to crystallize into something that might, eventually, demand action. The crisis deepened through the spring and early summer of 1940, and with each passing week, the evidence mounted that something was profoundly, systematically wrong with Germany's most advanced underwater weapon. The crews in the U-boats, those men who had volunteered for the most dangerous assignment in the entire German Navy, began to speak among themselves in careful whispers about what they were experiencing. The technical logs filled with notation after notation of failure, malfunction, disappointment, and mystery. A captain might fire a full salvo at a merchant vessel, a clear target, well within range, no evasive maneuvers possible, only to watch each torpedo pass harmlessly beneath or glide silently past, the target sailing on, unaware of how close death had come. It was, in some ways, a kind of mercy. In others, it was pure torture. By June of 1940, the German Navy's command structure was beginning to fracture under the weight of these repeated failures. The U-boat captains, men of considerable experience and expertise, were now openly questioning the integrity of the very machines they had been ordered to operate. How could they be expected to conduct warfare when their primary weapon would not function? How could they explain to their crews why they returned to base empty-handed and empty-credited, having made contact with the enemy yet achieved nothing? The morale problem was becoming as serious as the technical one. Admiral Karl Dönitz, the commanding officer of the U-boat arm and a man of towering confidence in his submarines and his men, found himself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. He had championed the Type XB U-boat as a marvel of modern engineering. He had told Berlin that his submarine fleet, properly supplied and properly armed, could strangle British trade and perhaps even force a negotiated peace. And now, increasingly, he was receiving reports from his most experienced captains suggesting that the very foundation of that strategy, the torpedo itself, was unreliable. Not occasionally, not under unusual circumstances, but systematically and catastrophically. The acoustic homing torpedoes, those sophisticated machines that were supposed to revolutionize naval warfare and make escort vessels almost helpless, had an additional problem that was only beginning to be understood. When a torpedo actually did detonate, and this was perhaps the cruelest irony of all, it sometimes failed to explode with anything approaching its designed force. The warhead, packed with explosives, would go off, yes, but the detonation was weak, uncertain, sometimes barely a spark when it should have been a thunderclap. Some captains theorized that the mechanisms were corroding, that moisture was seeping into the firing trains, that the oscillating systems were damaging the sensitive detonators. The exact cause remained obscure, buried beneath layers of mechanical complexity and the fog of wartime uncertainty. One particularly frustrated U-boat commander, Captain Heinz Schulze, would later recount an incident that seemed to encapsulate the entire nightmare of the torpedo crisis. He had maneuvered his submarine into what maritime strategists would call a perfect firing position. The target, a substantial British escort vessel, was moving at a predictable speed, on a steady course, at a range that should have been ideal for a successful attack. Schulze had calculated the angles of approach with mathematical precision. His torpedo crew was among the finest in the German Navy. Every condition was favorable, every factor aligned, and when he gave the order to fire, nothing happened. The torpedo that left the tube appeared to function normally at first. Then it began to deviate from its calculated course. The acoustic homing system, the very innovation that was supposed to make such attacks inevitable successes, seemed to have malfunctioned. Or perhaps, and this possibility haunted submariners like Schulze, the device had worked exactly as designed, but the design itself contained some fundamental flaw that no engineer had anticipated. The British, of course, were not ignorant of what was happening. Their intelligence services, always attentive to the patterns of enemy attack, had begun to notice something remarkable. The U-boats were firing, but missing. More than that, the U-boats seemed to be firing more frequently than the damage they were actually inflicting would suggest. In July of 1940, a British naval intelligence officer made a notation in his report that the German submarines appeared to be suffering from some kind of technical deficiency. But intelligence officers can only work from evidence, from pattern and inference. They could not fully understand, not yet, the true scope of the catastrophe unfolding in the German Navy's weapons laboratories and in the minds of the men piloting those submarines. By midsummer, the German Navy's technical establishment had begun to assemble a more complete picture of what was going wrong. The firing pin mechanisms, those small, seemingly insignificant components that were supposed to ignite the detonating charge when the torpedo struck its target, were proving unreliable under certain conditions. There were questions about the materials used, about manufacturing tolerance, about the influence of salt water and pressure, the oscillating mechanism, that complicated system of gyroscopes and weights that was supposed to keep the torpedo running parallel to the target's course, was showing signs of drift and degradation. The acoustic listening device itself might be working perfectly, but if the control mechanisms that responded to the acoustic signal were faulty, then the entire system became a kind of underwater phantom, a weapon that might hear its target perfectly well, but be unable to respond to that auditory information in any meaningful way. The atmosphere in the U-boat command offices grew increasingly tense as summer advanced toward autumn. Dönitz, a man of considerable determination and force of personality, began to press the technical services for answers. But technical services, like all military bureaucracies everywhere, moved slowly. There were tests to conduct, reports to file, chains of command to respect, and there was, perhaps most significantly, a certain institutional reluctance to admit that something so fundamental, something so central to German naval strategy, could be so profoundly broken. The weight of failure, once acknowledged in the corridors of German naval command, began to settle like sediment into every subsequent decision. By mid-1940, the men who had designed and deployed these faulty weapons faced a peculiar kind of reckoning, not yet public, not yet catastrophic enough to demand their removal, but persistent enough to gnaw at the edges of professional confidence. The reports continued to arrive from the North Sea and the Atlantic, each one a small wound to pride and capability. U-boat captains, those men tasked with the impossible work of strangling British supply lines, found themselves in a position of quiet desperation. They had been promised weapons of devastating precision. Instead, they held tubes filled with unreliable metal and misfiring detonators, and the enemy ships, those slow, laden cargo vessels carrying food and ammunition to Britain, continued to sail past, somehow spared by the very weapons meant to ensure German victory. What made this particular crisis so insidious was the gradual nature of its recognition. It was not a single catastrophic moment, but rather an accumulation of small disappointments that built into something far more corrosive to confidence and morale. A U-boat captain would report that he had lined up a shot with what he believed to be perfect execution, only to watch, in that sickening moment when a ship should have erupted in flame, as nothing happened at all. The torpedo either failed to detonate or struck the target at an angle that rendered it ineffective, or, in those cases that seemed almost designed to mock their creators, simply passed beneath the ship without making contact. How many times could a man repeat this sequence before the psychological weight began to affect his judgment, before he began to doubt not just the weapon, but the entire apparatus of decision-making that had put him in that position in the first place? The documentation of these failures, which we must remember was painstaking and honest in ways that military bureaucracies often are not, began to paint a picture of a system under strain. Naval engineers were tasked with investigating what had gone wrong, and their findings, though circumspect in language, pointed toward fundamental design flaws that should have been caught before a single weapon ever left the factory. The depth-keeping mechanisms, which were meant to maintain a torpedo at a predetermined depth as it traveled toward its target, were subject to variations in water density and temperature that the original designers had not adequately accounted for. In warmer waters, particularly in the Atlantic and the Mediterranean, where German U-boats were beginning to operate with greater frequency, these devices became increasingly unreliable. A torpedo set to run at a depth of 10 meters might, due to the subtle shift in water conditions, run at 12 or 15 meters instead, passing harmlessly beneath a ship that should have been destroyed. And then there was the matter of the contact fuses themselves. These delicate mechanisms, which relied on the impact of the warhead against a ship's hull to trigger the explosive charge, had been designed with assumptions about the structural properties of enemy vessels that did not always hold true in practice. Some ships, particularly those with wooden hulls or unusual construction methods, failed to provide the impact force necessary to set off the explosive charge. It was as if, in their precision, the German engineers had created weapons so exquisitely calibrated to a narrow set of conditions that they became fragile in the face of any deviation from those carefully calculated parameters. The irony would have been almost laughable had it not carried such weight for the men whose lives depended on them. By the autumn of 1940, as the U-boat arm continued its operations and the reports of failures continued to accumulate, a kind of dual consciousness began to emerge within the Naval High Command. On one level, there was acknowledgement, grudging, carefully worded, but real, that something was profoundly wrong. On another level, there was a persistent reluctance to accept the full implications of that acknowledgement. To admit that the torpedo was fundamentally flawed was, in some sense, to admit that the entire strategic vision upon which German naval operations had been based was itself flawed. If you could not reliably destroy enemy merchant vessels, how could you hope to strangle their supply lines? How could you win a naval war without the weapons you had been counting on? Consider, for a moment, the position of a commanding officer who receives reports like these. He knows his crews are dying, or risking death, in operations that are not achieving their intended results. He knows that better weapons exist in theory, that the technology to create them is available, that the problems could potentially be solved with time and resources. Yet he also knows that time is precisely what Germany does not have in abundance. The war, despite Hitler's public confidence, was already beginning to show the strain of being fought on multiple fronts. Resources that might have been devoted to fixing the torpedo problem were being pulled toward other projects, other priorities. The men in charge had to make decisions about where to allocate finite resources, and in those calculations, the flawed torpedo had to compete with everything else the German war machine demanded. The submarine crews themselves, those brave or perhaps desperate men who piloted U-boats into the North Atlantic, were in the strange position of being simultaneously trusted with the future of the war and equipped with weapons that could not be fully relied upon. They trained extensively with the torpedoes they had, studied their characteristics and quirks as thoroughly as possible, developed tactics to work around their limitations. But there is a psychological weight that comes with that kind of knowledge. You go into battle knowing that half the time, perhaps more than half the time, your weapons will fail you. What does that do to a man's courage, his willingness to take risks, his belief in ultimate victory? As we move deeper into the year of 1940, moving from autumn into the winter months when the Atlantic grows truly hostile and the odds of survival diminish with the temperature, the full extent of the torpedo crisis had become impossible to ignore, even for those who might have preferred to do so. And yet, even as this reality solidified, even as the evidence accumulated beyond any reasonable doubt, the process of actually fixing the problem had only begun. The mechanisms of military bureaucracy, of engineering review, of testing and redesign and production could not move faster than their inherent pace. Solutions would come eventually, but in war, eventually can mean the difference between victory and defeat, between the survival of thousands of men and their needless deaths. In that winter of 1940, Those in command could only proceed with the flawed weapons they had, and hope, a fragile thing in wartime, that something would change before the situation became truly untenable. The desperation that had been quietly gathering in German naval circles now became impossible to ignore. As the autumn of 1940 deepened, and U-boat commanders returned from patrols with accounts that seemed almost too strange to believe, the German Admiralty faced something far more troubling than simple bad luck. It was the beginning of a reckoning with the possibility that their most advanced technology had been fundamentally compromised by a flaw so deeply embedded in its design that correcting it would require an admission of failure at the highest levels. The thing about a weapon system that fails consistently is that it creates a peculiar kind of despair among those who depend upon it. A man can accept losing a battle to superior force. He can understand the mathematics of being outgunned or outmaneuvered, but to aim a lethal strike at an enemy, to have every calculation and condition seemingly aligned, and then to watch that strike pass beneath the target, or to strike it perfectly, only to hear nothing, this creates a different kind of frustration altogether. It is the frustration of a system betraying those who trusted it. By November of 1940, the acoustic detonators had become so notoriously unreliable that some U-boat captains were deliberately disabling them. Think for a moment about what that means. These were engineers and officers operating within a strictly hierarchical military structure, yet they were so completely lacking in confidence in their official equipment that they chose to remove the very mechanism they had been ordered to rely upon. They armed their torpedoes with only the mechanical contact fuse, the older, cruder method, knowing full well that this meant they would have to score direct hits to sink anything at all, that they would have to get closer, take greater risks, sacrifice some of the fundamental advantage that the acoustic system was meant to provide. This was not insubordination in any obvious sense. These captains were not refusing orders or openly challenging the competence of German weapons designers. Rather, they were engaging in a form of quiet pragmatism born of experience. They had been at sea. They had watched their weapons perform or fail. They had listened to the reports from comrades, and they had concluded, on the basis of overwhelming empirical evidence, that they could not afford to trust what the Admiralty was insisting was an achievement. The communications that began flowing through German naval channels in these months reveal a growing anxiety about what might be going wrong. Senior officers started requesting detailed information about the performance of the magnetic and acoustic detonators. They asked for statistics. They demanded explanations. And as these inquiries traveled up the chain of command, they encountered something that has plagued military organizations throughout history: the unwillingness of those responsible for a program to admit that the program might be fundamentally flawed. Dr. Hermann Lübeck, who had helped develop the acoustic torpedo system, received increasingly urgent requests to explain the failures. But Lübeck himself was caught in a difficult position. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the specific mechanical and acoustic challenges inherent in the design. He knew that the sensitivity of the listening apparatus was genuinely difficult to calibrate for the vastly different acoustic environments of different waters. He understood the physics of the problem, but understanding a problem and being able to communicate it clearly to military officials operating under pressure and expecting solutions rather than further complications are two very different things. There is something particularly poignant about the situation of the technical expert in wartime. They are expected to deliver solutions, to provide weapons that work, to ensure that the nation's investment in their research and their design produces results. The moment that they instead bring news of fundamental flaws, they are no longer messengers of capability, but harbingers of embarrassment and failure. The incentive structure of wartime, with its urgency, its demands for results, its zero tolerance for delay, makes it extraordinarily difficult for even honest experts to deliver the kind of bad news that their findings might actually represent. Consider the broader context in which these failures were occurring. Germany had begun the year 1940 with a sense of invincibility. The conquest of Poland had been swift. The invasion of France was in its planning stages, and it would soon prove to be spectacularly successful. The German military was on an upward trajectory of confidence and conquest. In such an atmosphere, the news that one of the most technologically sophisticated weapons systems in the arsenal was not performing as advertised was not merely disappointing. It was almost an insult to national achievement. And yet it was precisely this moment of overwhelming success that made the problem of the faulty torpedoes so difficult to see clearly. Those responsible for naval operations could point to the dramatic successes of the U-boat fleet in 1940, the tonnage of Allied shipping being sent to the bottom, the significant impact that the submarines were having on British supply lines. They could argue that even with the detonator problems, the submarines were still accomplishing their mission. Why then spend time and resources on a major redesign? Why admit failure when the overall strategic picture seemed so favorable? This is the trap that many military organizations have found themselves in throughout history, the inability to correct a significant problem because the problem has not yet caused a catastrophic failure. It is a subtle but crucial distinction. The torpedo detonators were not failing in spectacular ways that demanded immediate action. They were failing in ways that were costly and persistent, but not dramatic enough to force a reckoning at the highest levels of command. By the end of 1940, however, something was beginning to shift in the accumulated weight of evidence. Captain Karl Dönitz himself, the commander of Germany's U-boat fleet, and an officer whose opinion carried enormous weight with the Naval High Command, was becoming increasingly vocal about his concerns. Dönitz had built his reputation on aggressive tactics and on his ability to extract maximum performance from his crews and his equipment. He was not a man inclined to accept excuses, and what he was hearing from his captains was deeply troubling. The reports varied in detail and emphasis, but they painted a consistent picture. Magnetic detonators were unreliable, especially in northern waters where they seemed particularly prone to malfunction. Acoustic detonators were equally suspect, sometimes firing at odd moments when nothing was near, sometimes failing to fire when the geometry seemed perfect. The pattern was not random. There was structure to the failures. The problems were not so severe that they rendered the weapons completely useless, but they were severe enough that they meant a significant portion of the German submarine effort was being wasted on ineffective strikes and near misses. What neither Dönitz nor anyone else in the German military establishment yet knew was that the British had made significant progress in their own understanding of how the German torpedoes worked. They did not fully comprehend the magnetic detonator principle. Indeed, many aspects of it remained mysterious to them, but they had begun to understand the acoustic detonator well enough to develop countermeasures. They were learning how to defeat German technology, and that learning would only accelerate in the months ahead. The Atlantic itself seemed to be becoming an increasingly hazardous place for the German submarines, though the reasons were not entirely clear. The British were sinking U-boats at a rate that was worrying, even before accounting for the losses due to the torpedo failures. New technologies were being deployed against the German submarines. Radar was beginning to appear on British escort vessels. The coordination of convoy defense was improving. And threading through all of this was the growing recognition in German naval circles that something fundamental had gone wrong with the technological cornerstone of the submarine campaign. The German torpedo program had by now become something of a national obsession, though few outside the Naval High Command truly understood the depth of the crisis unfolding beneath the surface of the Atlantic. As autumn deepened into winter, the engineering teams working in the laboratories and testing grounds began to notice a pattern emerging that was both baffling and deeply troubling. The magnetic detonators, Those devices that were supposed to trigger the warhead when the torpedo passed beneath the steel hull of a ship were behaving in ways that seemed almost willfully unpredictable. Sometimes they functioned exactly as designed, sometimes they failed to activate at all, and sometimes, in what must have been a deeply frustrating mystery to the men tasked with perfecting them, they would detonate prematurely, wasting the precious weapon entirely. What had begun as a technical problem had quietly transformed into something far more consequential, a crisis of confidence in the very foundations of Germany's naval strategy. You might wonder how a nation that had invested so heavily in its submarine fleet could find itself in such a position, and the answer lies not in any single catastrophic decision, but rather in a cascade of smaller choices and assumptions that had accumulated over years. The magnetic detonator technology itself had been developed with considerable ingenuity. It represented a leap forward in naval thinking, a way to concentrate explosive force more efficiently than the older contact fuses that had been used since the First World War. The theory was elegant. Instead of requiring a direct hit on the hull, a torpedo passing beneath a ship would trigger a magnetic field detector, causing the warhead to explode upward and break the vessel's back. In principle, it was vastly superior to what other navies possessed. But in practice, the theory began to crumble almost immediately upon contact with the reality of the Atlantic Ocean. The fundamental problem, which would eventually become clear to the German engineers, centered on the complexity of the magnetic environment surrounding any ship. The Earth itself possesses a magnetic field that varies by latitude, and the hull of a ship, particularly a metal warship, creates its own distinct magnetic signature. These forces interact in ways that are profoundly difficult to predict or control. A detonator calibrated to function perfectly in the waters near Norway might fail entirely when the same torpedo was deployed further south. The latitude alone could render months of careful engineering work essentially useless. Beyond this, the engineers began to discover that even minor variations in the strength of the Earth's magnetic field between different oceanic regions could push the weapon's performance into unpredictability. It was as though the Atlantic itself was conspiring against German precision. There were also deeper structural issues that were only slowly being recognized. The detonator mechanisms themselves were sensitive instruments, and during manufacture and transport, they were prone to subtle damage that was often impossible to detect with the inspection methods available at the time. A hairline crack in a crystal within the device, a tiny displacement of electrical contacts. These were changes so small that they might escape notice during routine quality control, yet they could render the detonator completely unreliable. Consider the thousands of torpedoes being produced, each one containing one of these delicate mechanisms, each one subjected to the stresses of manufacture, storage, transport, and deployment. The margin for error was vanishingly small, and yet error was building up within the arsenal in ways that nobody could precisely quantify. By late 1940, the reports flowing back from the submarine captains were becoming increasingly pointed. Officers who had expected these new weapons to give them decisive advantages found themselves holding devices that were little better than old-fashioned contact torpedoes in their actual performance, and sometimes significantly worse. The contact fuses at least provided a kind of baseline reliability. They worked when they touched something solid, but the magnetic detonators had become a source of profound frustration and mounting doubt. What had begun as an engineering challenge had begun to feel, to those in command, like something approaching a failure of the entire procurement system. The men who had designed and promoted this technology, men who had staked their reputations on its superiority, now found themselves in an increasingly difficult position. There were hints of awareness that something was deeply wrong, but the information was not yet flowing through the command structure in any organized or clear way, Messages from captains in the field were scattered, sometimes contradictory. Some pilots reported complete failures, others reported that the detonators worked perfectly. Without a centralized system for collecting and analyzing failure data, the true scope of the problem remained partially obscured even to those in Berlin who were tasked with overseeing the weapons program. This fog of partial information would prove to be one of the most consequential aspects of the entire crisis. A nation at war faces an almost overwhelming torrent of data from its various theaters and commands, and sorting signal from noise under such circumstances is enormously difficult. Reports of weapons failures must compete for attention with reports of victories, losses, supply problems, personnel issues, and 100 other urgent matters. A submarine captain's field report about detonator problems, even if it reached Berlin, might arrive in a folder containing dozens of other communications, many of them seeming more immediately pressing. The human mind struggles to perceive a pattern when the evidence is scattered across time and space and filtered through multiple layers of military hierarchy. What would later become obvious, that there was a fundamental flaw affecting thousands of weapons, remained difficult to fully perceive in the moment, when the information arrived in fragments and contradictions. There is something almost melancholic about the situation as it was developing during this period. The German Navy had invested tremendous resources, both material and intellectual, in the development of this new technology. Thousands of people had worked on various aspects of the program. Factories had been retooled, supply chains established, training programs created. All of this effort had been guided by a genuine belief in the superiority of the approach, by confidence in German engineering, and by the strategic necessity of achieving some kind of advantage in a war that was becoming increasingly desperate. And yet, despite all of this, the weapons being produced were fundamentally unreliable in ways that would eventually prove catastrophic to the naval strategy that depended on them. The tragedy lay not in the attempt at innovation itself, but in the way the attempt had been made, with insufficient testing, with overconfidence in the theory, and with systems of feedback that were too slow and too fragmented to allow for rapid course correction. The magnitude of this failure was beginning to dawn on the German High Command, though it would take weeks for the full picture to crystallize. Reports were trickling in from U-boat commanders, from surface raider captains, from intelligence officers who had begun to piece together the troubling truth. The weapons that had been heralded as revolutionary, as instruments of swift and decisive underwater victory, were instead becoming a source of bewilderment and, quietly, of profound embarrassment. And yet, in those early weeks of autumn in 1940, there remained a peculiar hesitation to confront the reality head-on. Could it truly be that systematic, that widespread, that the very foundation of the torpedo campaign was flawed? The German Navy had invested so much into this strategy, so much time and resources and hope. To admit failure now would mean re-examining everything. Consider for a moment what the engineers and designers at the German torpedo facilities must have been experiencing. They had, in their own minds, created something elegant and efficient. The designs were sound, the mathematics worked on paper, the detonators functioned in isolation tests. And yet, somewhere in the translation from theory to practice, from the calm waters of a test range to the turbulent chaos of actual combat, something had gone terribly, systematically wrong. It's a peculiar kind of anguish, perhaps, to know your creation is failing, but to struggle to understand why. The intelligence officers and naval strategists began to gather the data more methodically. They looked at the statistics emerging from the U-boat arm, the number of vessels that had reported premature detonations, the tonnage that should have been sunk, calculated on paper, versus the tonnage that had actually been destroyed. The disparity was staggering. A submarine commander might report using 5 or 6 torpedoes against a single target, watching them run true, seeing them strike, yet the target sailed on. Or worse, hearing the explosion echo through the water at the wrong moment, when the torpedo was still hundreds of meters away. These were not failures of will or courage. These were failures of machinery. By the autumn of 1940, certain patterns were becoming unmistakable to those who looked closely. The G7E model, the electric torpedo, seemed to be suffering particularly acute difficulties. The magnetic detonators, which had been the source of such confidence just months earlier, appeared to be malfunctioning with what might almost be described as consistency. There was something about the electrical systems, something about the magnetic field generation, something about the sensitivity thresholds that was simply not working as intended. But identifying the problem and solving it were two very different matters indeed. One of the most perplexing aspects of this unfolding crisis was the nature of the failures themselves. They were not uniform. Some torpedoes worked flawlessly. Others failed repeatedly. Some commanders reported issues that others did not encounter. This variability created a fog of uncertainty. Were the failures due to manufacturing inconsistencies? Were they the result of environmental factors, the temperature of the water, the salinity, the depth at which the weapon was employed? Were they caused by improper maintenance or handling by crews who, despite their training, might have made subtle errors? The answers would not come quickly or easily, and in the meantime, the U-boat arm continued to operate with weapons they could not fully trust. The psychological impact on the submarine crews cannot be understated. A U-boat commander who had maneuvered carefully into position, who had calculated the angles with precision, who had released his torpedoes and waited with the characteristic tension of underwater warfare, only to see them fail or behave unpredictably. This experience bred a kind of creeping doubt. How could you have confidence in your tactical decisions when your equipment was unreliable? How could you trust your training and your instincts when the fundamental tools of your profession were compromised? There was also, one might speculate, a certain resistance to fully acknowledging the scope of the problem. In military organizations, admitting to catastrophic equipment failures can have profound consequences for those in positions of responsibility. Design engineers might face scrutiny, supply officers might face investigation, naval leadership might face questions from higher authorities about why these defects had not been caught before deployment. It is a very human tendency to hope that a problem might resolve itself, or that it might be more limited in scope than it actually is, or that a quick fix might soon set things right. But the Atlantic in 1940 was not a place where problems resolved themselves quietly. The British, by contrast, were beginning to understand something was working in their favor. They did not, of course, know the full extent of the German torpedo crisis. Intelligence only captures fragments of the enemy's struggles, but they were noticing something. U-boat attacks were not having the devastating effect that had been predicted. Ships were being sunk, certainly, but at rates lower than the strategic models had suggested they should be. And occasionally, reports would come in of strange occurrences. A ship struck by a torpedo that seemed to malfunction. An attack that should have been lethal but resulted only in damage. These observations, scattered and incomplete as they were, began to form a pattern in the minds of naval analysts. The autumn months of 1940 slipped into the early winter with a kind of terrible momentum. The German Navy was committed to its submarine strategy. The U-boats were being produced, equipped, and deployed according to plan. The crews were training, the tactics were being refined, the long struggle for control of the Atlantic was reaching its intensity. And yet, beneath the surface of this massive undertaking, a quiet catastrophe was playing out. Weapons that should have been working were not. Ships that should have been sunk were surviving. Resources that should have brought overwhelming advantage were instead proving to be, in many cases, nearly useless. It was a situation without an easy solution, and one that would demand not just technical expertise, but also a kind of humble acknowledgement that something fundamental had gone wrong in the design and conception of these weapons. The weight of this realization, that weapons bearing such promise had become instruments of failure, began to press heavily on the minds of those responsible. Admiral Dönitz himself had been present during many of the trials, had watched the torpedoes glide through test waters with apparent precision, and yet the gap between expectation and reality had grown so vast that it could no longer be ignored or rationalized away. The U-boat commander whose vessel had struck the aircraft carrier Courageous, achieving what should have been a triumphant sinking, found himself decorated and celebrated, yet privately aware that the success had come despite the weapon, not because of it. The uncertainty crept through the submarine fleet like a shadow, a quiet knowledge that the technological edge Germany had counted upon was splintering beneath them. By the winter of 1940, investigation committees were quietly formed, though their work proceeded with the caution that comes when one must tell a military leadership that their most advanced weapons are fundamentally broken. The engineers and technicians who had designed the G7E knew they bore some responsibility, and yet they also understood that the weapon had been forced into service before adequate testing could be completed. Time, that precious commodity in wartime, had been denied to them. The pressure to deploy, to show results, to justify the vast resources poured into the U-boat program, had created an environment where thoroughness was sacrificed to urgency. One might wonder whether this tension between the need for immediate advantage and the necessity of adequate preparation represents something universal in warfare, a pattern that repeats across centuries and nations. The magnetic detonator, that elegant innovation that promised to trigger the torpedo's warhead simply by passing beneath a target's hull, had become an almost mythical source of difficulty. Investigations revealed that the Earth's magnetic field itself behaved differently in certain regions, particularly in northern waters, where the compass deviates from true north in ways that early 20th century science had not fully mapped. The torpedo's detonating mechanism, designed with measurements taken from temperate European latitudes, began to malfunction as U-boats operated in the colder waters of the Atlantic and around the British Isles. The very geography of war had rendered the weapon less reliable, as if the ocean itself conspired against German precision. And beyond the magnetic complications, there emerged reports, fragmentary at first, then increasingly undeniable, that some torpedoes were passing directly beneath targets and failing to explode at all, their magnetic sensors somehow deactivated or simply non-responsive. The human cost of these failures accumulated quietly. Crew members aboard damaged merchant vessels and escorting warships had no way of knowing that the torpedo spreading destruction beneath them was itself a wounded thing, a prototype that should never have been asked to bear the burden of warfare. British salvage operations occasionally recovered portions of dud torpedoes, and through intelligence channels, some understanding of German difficulties began to emerge. Yet even as the British learned of these vulnerabilities, the German command structure remained deeply divided about how to respond. Some commanders advocated for an immediate return to the proven, reliable contact detonators, the simple percussion mechanism that had served previous generations of submarines. These devices were less sophisticated, certainly less elegant in their engineering, but they worked with a consistency that the magnetic systems could never match. Others in the naval hierarchy resisted this step backward with considerable force, arguing that to abandon the magnetic detonator would be to sacrifice the technological advantage that German industry had labored so intensely to create. There exists in warfare a peculiar psychology around new weapons, a reluctance to admit that innovation has failed, a tendency to blame implementation rather than conception. If we might observe without judgment, this pattern seems to recur throughout military history. the investment in a new approach becomes so substantial, the reputation of those who championed it so entangled with its success, that acknowledging fundamental flaws becomes a kind of professional suicide. The torpedo crisis of 1940, in this light, was not merely a technical problem to be solved, but a crisis of institutional pride and competing visions of Germany's technological future. Through the late autumn and into the early winter months, as the year 1940 drew toward its close, the debate continued in naval headquarters. Reports came in regularly from U-boat captains, many of them experienced commanders who had sunk substantial tonnage and understood warfare intimately. Their accounts were consistent and troubling, target after target appearing clearly through the periscope, the firing solution calculated with precision, the torpedo track observed running true toward its mark, and then nothing. The vessel would continue on its way, apparently unaware that it had come within meters of destruction. Or worse, the explosion would come, but somehow the damage seemed disproportionately small for a torpedo strike, as if the warhead had detonated at some distance from the hull rather than in the destructively intimate proximity the designers had envisioned. The submarine service itself began to fragment under the weight of these failures. Some crews became demoralized, questioning whether their courage and skill made any difference when their weapons themselves could not be trusted. Others grew angry, directing their frustration toward the weapons designers and the naval command that had equipped them with unreliable systems. A few captains, those with sufficient standing and experience, began submitting written reports that amounted to quiet accusations of negligence. The official channels of the German Navy, accustomed to hierarchy and obedience, found themselves receiving increasingly pointed critiques from the men actually operating these weapons in the cold and dangerous waters of the Atlantic. What had seemed, in the drawing rooms and laboratories where they were designed, to be a triumph of German engineering, was proving, in the grim reality of combat, to be a catastrophe of unfulfilled promise. And so, as we settle into the quieter spaces of this history, what remains is perhaps the most enduring lesson of the torpedo crisis of 1940, a moment when the most carefully planned machinery of war met its match not in the valor of enemies, but in the silent failures of its own making. The German Navy had entered this conflict with confidence, with sleek vessels and the promise of technological supremacy, yet found themselves undone again and again by the very instruments they believed would deliver them victory. There is something deeply, profoundly human in this story, something that transcends the specifics of naval warfare or the particular moment of 1940. It speaks to the universal gap between intention and outcome, between what we design and what actually comes to pass when our creations meet the unpredictable world. The men aboard those British and Norwegian vessels, the sailors who survived the faulty detonations, who found themselves alive when they should have perished, carried with them a gift born of German incompetence, though they could hardly have seen it that way in the moment. They lived to see their families again. They lived to grow older. They lived to eventually wonder, perhaps, what small miracle had intervened on their behalf. And far away, in the offices of the Kriegsmarine, officers began the long, uncomfortable work of facing what had gone wrong, of acknowledging that brilliance in conception does not guarantee success in execution. Engineering is not destiny. Confidence is not armor. What strikes us now, looking backward across more than 8 decades, is how fragile the machinery of total war truly was. For all the industrial might that Nazi Germany could marshal, for all the scientific minds bent toward the production of perfect weapons, the torpedo crisis reveals something quieter and perhaps more universal, that human systems are inherently imperfect, that oversight occurs even among the most rigorous planners, that feedback loops can be slow and bureaucratic resistance can be powerful. The German Navy had known something was wrong with their torpedoes for months before the Norwegian campaign. They had received reports, had evidence, yet the path from observation to action moved with the sluggish speed of military hierarchy and institutional doubt. In this we find no villains, really, only the inevitable friction that occurs when human beings attempt to coordinate vast and complex enterprises. The engineers who designed the torpedoes were not careless. The officers who approved their deployment were not reckless. And yet the outcome was failure, repeated and consequential, a crisis that rippled through the entire strategic calculus of the early war. One might pause here and consider what this means for any large endeavor, whether military, industrial, scientific, or otherwise. How many plans fail not because they were poorly conceived, but because the gap between theory and practice proved wider than anyone anticipated? How many initiatives founder not on the rocks of fundamental error, but on the accumulated weight of small oversights, each one seemingly manageable in isolation? The torpedo crisis passed, as all crises do. The German Navy eventually repaired their weapons. New detonators were installed. Depth-setting mechanisms were refined. The faulty torpedoes became museum pieces, historical curiosities that school children learn about in the context of their failures. Yet what lingers is not the technical resolution, but the human dimension, the recognition that even in the midst of history's largest and most terrible conflict, there were moments of mechanical failure, moments where chance and circumstance played as vital a role as strategy and courage. A faulty detonator becomes, in its way, a small agent of mercy, a silent force that prevented certain deaths, that altered outcomes in ways that no one could have fully predicted or calculated. As the night deepens around you, and your mind begins to settle into that gentle space between waking and sleep, consider what this history offers us. It is not a story of triumph or tragedy in the conventional sense. It is a story of systems and their limits, of how even the most formidable machinery can be undone by something as simple as a design error or a bureaucratic delay in responding to evidence. The men who sailed the North Sea in 1940, whether aboard German submarines or Allied surface vessels, were caught in currents far larger than themselves, swept along by tides of history and accident in equal measure. They did not control the outcomes that befell them. They were subject to forces, some of them human-made, others the result of pure mechanical chance, that lay entirely beyond their influence or knowledge. There is comfort in this, perhaps, for the modern listener. The world is far more complex and unpredictable than any single human mind can fully grasp or control. Plans fail, careful systems break down. The best-laid intentions of powerful institutions can come undone through mechanisms so mundane that they might seem almost embarrassing in their ordinariness. And yet from these failures, from these moments where everything that should have worked simply did not, emerge unexpected mercies. Lives are spared, futures are changed. The arc of history bends in directions that no amount of planning could have anticipated. The torpedo crisis of 1940 offers us, then, a quiet lesson for the night, that perfection is impossible, that failure is woven into the fabric of any human endeavor, and that sometimes, in ways we will never fully understand, the things that go wrong are the things that need to go wrong. The faulty torpedo that failed to detonate, the depth-setting mechanism that malfunctioned at the critical moment, the chain of command that moved too slowly to adapt and respond. These were failures, yes, but they were also, from another perspective, interventions, invisible hands that altered the course of individual lives and perhaps, in their small way, the larger history itself. As you drift deeper into the quietness of the night, allow yourself to rest in this paradox. Let your breathing slow. Let your mind settle into the knowledge that the world operates according to patterns far more intricate and mysterious than we can fully comprehend from within the moment. The engineers who designed the torpedoes, the admirals who ordered their deployment, the sailors who lived through their failures, all of them were caught in a story larger than themselves, moved by forces they could not entirely control or predict. We are no different. We too exist within systems and circumstances that extend far beyond our understanding or influence, and perhaps there is peace to be found in that recognition, peace in the understanding that we are not required to be perfect, that failure is not a flaw in our nature, but an essential part of how the world actually works. Let the torpedo crisis settle into your mind as you settle into sleep. Hold it lightly, the way you might hold a memory of something that happened long ago and far away. It is a story without a simple moral, without a clear lesson that applies neatly to your waking life. It is simply a moment in history when careful plans met unexpected obstacles, when sophisticated machinery proved less sophisticated than its creators believed, when the gap between intention and outcome revealed itself to be wider and stranger than anyone could have predicted.